Alrighty, so on the podcast today we have Jason Round, MoveMore MP on Instagram. Been following your work for a while, mate. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Pat.
So just to give us a bit of context, I'd really love you to tell your story about how you got into movement, but through the lens of how your ideas evolved about it and maybe what your thinking was, pre what you're doing now, and then what was the evolution to this point from that more kind of conceptual lens and how you think about your practice and your teaching.
Okay, so it's quite nice you introduced that perspective, because I would perhaps call that, the evolution of the perspective as time went through. I mean, initially, as I've explained in other places and written on my website as well, because I think sometimes it's useful for people, that I started from very much what might be considered, a training background. The word practice never really came into my mind. It was like training. Like, are you training today? Why aren't you training more? Like, where do you train? It's always about training. So at that point in time, I really believed that you practice the physical practice, not that there was a terminology I was using, but essentially either to build bigger muscles or look better. I had no wider perspective than that. That was it. I even had a conversation with a friend at the time who was a climber, and he was trying to explain to me that, he also, used things like the gym and physical practice to improve his discipline. And I was like, nah, but you also go there, just to look good. And like, he was like, yeah, but it's not really, I couldn't really see past that. So that's really where I came from. When I started to explore things a little bit more, it was more through the perspective of calisthenics. And by the perspective, I mean the training methodology and also the processes, the structures, the movement contexts, like the straight arm strength, front lever, back lever, human flags, and the very limited stuff that you would do for your lower body as well. I kind of exhausted the very shallow pool of that. But basically, this still came from the previous perspective I had before. I still had in my mind, training, more is better, do more. I still wanted to maintain an aesthetic physique. I was still looking through a perspective of strength practice, essentially. So it was pretty much exactly the same, which is why when I came into contact with the work of Ido Portal, who has, of course, inspired many people in what we might call perhaps the modern movement culture in a way. And through him and through other tangents, coming into encountering other people's work, I then actually first ever began to ask the question, okay, like, why am I moving? Like, why am I doing this? I mean, the word movement wasn't even there yet. I was still, as many people I speak to today, that if we speak about movement, I will quite frankly say, I practice and I teach movement. And it will always be like, what do you mean movement? And it's very important for me to bring myself back to the place that you're bringing me to, which is no, what does it mean for someone who doesn't have that involved as a practice or as a part in their life, or that hasn't, thought about this term and the consequences of it. So, at this point in time, I wasn't thinking about movement. So when it was presented, I actually then had to think, no, what does this mean? Which I did for many years consequently and still do to this day. And also at that particular point in time, asked that question, as I said, why am I moving? And then when I actually began reflection on my previous history, so at that point, talking around maybe 2015, I was like, wow, my reasons for moving are pretty shitty. Like, they're really crappy reasons for moving. And in all honesty, what it has brought me so far in terms of what we might call movability, the ability to move, is pretty crappy as well. Because, I was, restrictions that you don't even know that you have because you've never placed yourself into these particular movement contexts. And as soon as you do things like apply weight onto the hands and realize, wow, I mean, my wrists, this is not going to work. Or you do something like you explore a more detailed pattern with the legs, some crossing over with the legs or lower positions in what I call the low gate position. That's when you start to realize, wow, my discipline, my personal context, my previous work that I've been doing for the past 10 years has brought me shit. Like the most thing that it brought me, which can't be overlooked as well, is more of a social, like more of a social value. Like, I would go out and people would look at me in a certain way because I look like a trained person, and that's all that comes at face value. It's be like, oh yeah, I can see that you're trained, bro. Like I can see, and this is it. And that was enough at that time, because I hadn't seen beyond a certain hill. And I don't like it to sound so much like a type of Plato's cave context, like, oh guys, you need to get out of the cave and look what's really there. I'm not trying to put that across. I'm simply speaking of, that I didn't see over what was a little bit a hill there. So when it came to that point when I was questioning, okay, what am I doing? How am I practicing? That was the point where I realized that, the calisthenics type practice that I'd then been involved in for like 2 or 3 years was exactly the same as, the bodybuilding context. There was nothing different in terms of the intention behind it, which is something really, really important that I really forefront now with the people I work with closely. The intention, what do you mean to do? What are you actually doing with your action? Because there's a difference between, I can do a front lever with like a calisthenics intention, or I can do a front lever with an intention coming from a movement perspective, and it completely changes the experience. It completely changes the experience. Just like you can look at two people with closed eyes. One person might be deep in meditation. The other person is, slacking off in a meeting. It's just like, half asleep. So I was at this point where I was, very deeply questioning what I was doing. And when I came into the contact with the material that Ido had shared through his older blogs and the plethora of stuff that was actually available to research and to practice, I pretty much just started still from that perspective of training. And we can come to these differentiations in the future. They're things that I've thought about, these are the kind of terminologies, because it can be sometimes difficult to think training, exercise, practice, what's really the difference here? These are the things that I realized it was really important to dig into, to even begin to ask the question, what is it that I'm doing? Because I had no differentiation between this terminology, but there was a difference. So this is essentially what was going on in the background psychologically while I was just like, okay, just practice. That's it. All I know how to do is train. Like that's all I know. I know I can do that bit. I can train harder than that person. I train harder, not harder is better, but this is what I knew how to do. I knew that I could beast it. So I sat down. I just say sat down for like a year, essentially beasting it. I beasted through all the material that was available, everything I could find. I spent a lot of time deep in that. And then, after the 6 months, 1 year passed, and then I started to feel restrictions as a result of having abused my body in the process. And that was a huge waking up as well. It's something that I continue to deal with until this day, that I manage. It's a part of my movement past that I continue to improve. But in going through all of those patterns, these new types of movements, in my own micro movement exploration, just with the material that was available, it was impossible to ignore the psychological change that also happens in that process as part of it. And this can be due to a couple of things. I mean, if you want to look at it on the neurological level, you're exploring things, you're working through problems, your body is moving in specific ways that in many cases are encouraging neurological development, neuromovement patterns, which do have an effect on the brain and ultimately your thinking as a whole. So there's that aspect of it as well. But then there's also the aspect of like, why wasn't I doing this before? Like, what did I waste my 10 years on? Not that bad. I mean, I had managed to develop two things that were hugely valuable. A certain level of physiological capacity, a restricted level of physiological capacity, but it was there. Like I was riding off strength, pure strength for a long time. And that's what got me into the trouble with tendonitis and things like this. Because I was riding off strength, you know, I could cheat with strength, only to a certain point. And the second thing is ethic, work ethic, practice ethic, training ethic, which in many cases I find is a very, very rare thing to find. And this is the thing that I find separates, even still, you know, back from the the old Arnold pumping iron days. This is the difference of what separates the normal competitor from the champion. You know, again, I'm not shouting out that I'm a champion or anything like that, but there's a certain practice ethic, which can again be divided into two. One is the diligent practitioner or the trainer. The diligent person is the one who looks in every hole. They try to pull out every single, you know, mechanical advantage or disadvantage that they can find in a specific movement to make it even more effective. How can I enter the floor softer? You know, how can I, you know, turn the teacup and hit the side delt a bit more? You know, all these kind of weird little things, but you can apply it to all types of movement contexts. How can I be more effective? How can I be more get more out of this particular context, as opposed to just, you know, just repping it, so to speak. I was always deep into that. Everyone who worked with me, everyone who I taught, even in the realms of calisthenics and in the realms of bodybuilding, hypertrophy training, were aware of that, which is why they came to me, which is why in some cases they even said, you know, told once in the gym that people starting to find me intimidating, which I completely laugh because I think I'm the most unintimidating person ever. But they said, no, it's the way that you train. It's the way that you train. And the way that you train other people as well. Because I wouldn't, I'm like, you know, look, if I am doing this, this means something to me. If I'm sharing this with you, it must mean something to you. If it does not, I'm wasting my time and you're wasting your time, because this is valuable to me. And I do not want to share something that's valuable with me, watered down in any kind of, you know, just to make it a bit easier for you. It's like, no, this is what we're practicing. This is what we're training. Coming from a bodybuilding perspective, I can start to understand now this could be quite intimidating. It's kind of like, no, you got to beast it. So this is one part of it, you know, having that diligent work ethic. The second aspect, if I remind myself of that, is it ties very closely to the first one, but it's also just the digging deeper. There's always something else to learn from it. There's always something else to learn from a specific type of context. I would milk things, absolutely milk things, which is why when, for example, someone would refer to a certain movement of me as like, oh, wow, you can do this movement, or how long will it take to do that movement, blah, blah, blah. And in many cases, it's like, man, not that I've had this particular movement as a project for this amount of time, but, you know, I started doing that movement like 10, 12 years ago. Like, and I'm still doing that one movement to this day. You know, there are people who dedicate their entire lives to the back squat. You can even get you know this now, you can get a PhD in this. You can be called Dr. Squat at the end. That's a complete shitty joke about Dr. Squat. But in any case, you know, you can milk these things. And these are the things that I had. You know, I would milk things. I would try to learn as much as I could from a context, and I would just drill stuff and try to find, you know, the nuances of all these types of movements, which is what, for me, I think gave me the ability to then share these nuances with other people and them see the difference in the effect of their practice. Which is why, for example, when we have things like, we'll get onto this later, but when people work with me one-on-one, or if they work on a standardized program, in many cases, you know, like anyone who's able to give effective feedback, the effect of that feedback is voiced from the other side. Like, wow, I did this thing and it changed it completely. For me, that's just as a result of experience, but having looked into it with a very critical eye, having looked into it with the subjective eye as well as the objective eye. How do I feel when I do this? What would, you know, in terms of physics with this movement, what would be the ideal way to do it? How does that actually feel in application? This is all the stuff that's going on in the background that I feel in many cases when I see people practice, even if they have the willing heart and everything into it, it's missing. And it comes to a limitation at that point. We start to transgress from that point from, you know, being, you know, guided, because the only teacher I ever had was YouTube. YouTube, many things you can find on there that the enemies of freedom don't want you to find. But YouTube, watching stuff, that was it. Didn't have a teacher. Like, and this is even something nice that Tom Wexler brought up in a recent workshop, really fantastic workshop with him and Carsten Salzburg. Sorry, Carsten, if I got your second name wrong. But in any case, Tom, forefronted the idea of becoming the teacher of yourself and improving the practice of becoming the teacher of yourself. This is something I think nowadays is hugely important, not just with the cases of actual distances, in many cases having to be between teachers and their students or things like this, or whoever it is that you gain inspiration from. It's a vital thing to develop if you ultimately want to have a practice that is yours, that belongs to you, which is a product of your movement past, specifically of what you want to do, which is when I bring back again to my own experience, I've rambled on about, but this was the question that I was not asking when I was doing calisthenics. I wasn't like, is this actually what I am wanting to do? If I had truly asked that question at that point, if I'd never come into, encountered something like the physical practice of hypertrophy and things and all the ideology that's based around that, I think I might have well as easily, if I had encountered this this culture, entered myself into like an arts performance culture, entered myself into a dance culture or something like this. It could have just as easily happened, and perhaps would have actually sat with me better with my personal inclinations. But my personal inclinations fell by the wayside because it was training. We train. That's it. No questions asked. And so yeah, I was at that point in time, I was just training, I was doing the work, getting the work done, not doing it very smartly, becoming injured. And this, of course, would have been the benefit of having a teacher at that time to help steer me away from those things. But I equally learned from those ideas. Then visiting, so I learned from those experiences. And then onward, as I started to actively try to involve myself in what was, growing as an idea of a movement culture, I started, and this was again through the visiting workshops of Ido Portal, I started to grow a closeness with many people from the Portuguese movement community as well, because they hosted this event yearly in Lisbon. Later to this point, of course, not quite now, but Diego was working on bringing the European movement meeting to Lisbon, which he hosted it absolutely fantastically 2 years running. It's unfortunate it didn't continue. But essentially, having then brought myself to connect and practice with and speak with and exchange ideas with people who were, quote unquote, on the same page, but on the same page, I basically mean lost in the same room or floating on the same ocean, that my perspective then started to realize that this is something that's more than just a physical practice. I still use the term physical practice a lot today to avoid a lot of confusions. And again, we can speak on that later, why I choose this word physical practice. But it was then I started to have more of a desire to share these things. And it did start off as like almost like a crusade type thing. I think it does in many people who find themselves encountering this type of essentially the material and of course the perspectives as well. You really, really want to share it. And for better or for worse, it can come to that point where, you start to think that you know more than you know, and then perhaps you're sharing more than you should and all. But I was trying to be very deliberate to share it, again, still within the context of training, because I knew that this was kind of what I was still limited to, and in many cases still am now in my own way. And that, yeah, essentially brought me to the point when people started listening and responding to the things that I was sharing. And so, of course, this then changes your perspective as well. Then I start to ask myself, okay, at this point in practice, what is my role perhaps in this wider movement culture? And then I start to ask myself, okay, is there a responsibility of people who believe that they have tools and perspectives on physical practice that can benefit other people in the wider community? Is there also a type of responsibility on me for that as well? Or perhaps am I just placing that responsibility on myself out of some kind of self-importance, which can be a really, really bad thing, but can also ultimately turn it into a good thing eventually. So this is just how the perspective just starts to develop, and it never really came, never comes. It's not at a point where I'm like, okay, got it now. Yeah, got it now. Write it down. It's all there. As I mentioned, this is the reason why I think, you know, many movement practitioners or teachers, and myself, relish an opportunity to be able to share some words to externalize some thoughts, because they will be different in some years to come. If they're not different, we have not been practicing. It should continuously be changing. I mean, so through that point where I work with the calisthenics and I work with this basic kind of material, which is, you know, in its subject essence, you know, types of locomotion, the floreo and things that, you know, was sharing, I started to build certain physical capacities and abilities that then people were looking at that point and going, wow, I would like to be able to do that as well. And I didn't really have a solid way to be able, I didn't have my own way of sharing those training experiences. Firstly, because I hadn't really developed, I hadn't had enough experience and developed those subject areas myself, my exploration of it. And, you know, secondly, I was still working on myself. I wasn't really in a position to start sharing with people. It was a few years later until it got to a point where the perspective kind of changed to, okay, I think I can actually start to put some of these pieces together into a programmable format that people can replicate, and from that develop their own experience physiologically and, you know, everything else as part of their being that comes with it. Essentially just help them develop their own practice, not the practice that I want them to do, but to give them a certain context written out on a piece of paper in the form of programming, because programming, that's just the context we're working with. You could even write a story and someone could train from that, but it just wouldn't be very convenient. Programming is a convenient context for physical practice. So can I write it in the structure and then transmit a movement experience to people through that? And then, of course, psychological, physiological developments happen as part of the process. You learn some skills, blah, 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 blah. You know, can I do that? And, you know, some years ago when I started looking into that, it started off with friends. That's when I started moving more into the perspective of, no, okay, I think I can place myself now in a position of someone who is sharing. And there's a trade-off with that. I mean, in many cases, when you are working on, you know, sharing your material or developing things, you know, that are more conducive for, you know, I hate to use the word to be consumed, but on the other side, the user experience is not necessarily more friendly, but it's more conducive to creating the experience that you want them to have, whether that's creating a better video resource or whether that's finding a new pedagogical method to explain or bring that across to them. You know, this comes sometimes at a sacrifice of your own practice. It can either be with regards to time. You have to invest more time to be able to develop stuff to share with other people, or it diverts your interest from, you know, other things you could be exploring, perhaps back to old projects that you maybe previously closed, just to open them again, just to go through them. So it takes up resources, and resources are limited. I see this a lot with Yuri Marmerstein, for example. He says it now and then. You'll see a video clip from him and he'll be like, you know, our first time in the gym for 6 months. You know, but the man was, you know, giving so many workshops, sharing so many things that you can't always do all these things all at the same time, and you have to be selective in the position you wish to put yourself in. So long story short, I went from the perspective of like, yeah, I'm just training, even through when I encountered the movement material, it's really bad. But yeah, just training to the point of, no, actually, okay, why am I doing this? To then the perspective as, okay, now I think I'm in a certain position. What is my responsibility? How do I move forward from this point? So in some cases, it's like it seems that when we speak about movement practice, it's only the cliche terms that, you know, seem to fit, but it's kind of like, you know, self-realization in the terms of, oh, okay, like I actually could do something now with this. I could perhaps help people, or I could just like stay in the back gym and just keep training myself and keep myself to myself. And a large part of my character, in all honesty, would prefer just to shut the door, close the windows, and just train by myself. But this is not conducive to a movement practice. It's not conducive to, you know, social experience, which is a huge part of human experience in general. So I have to practice that aspect as well. In many cases, that's why I always say to people, even though, you know, the MoveMore thing now is essentially my little business. I always just call it my project. It's just a project I always just started, and it's like, okay, have I got something valuable to share? Is it going to contribute? And yeah, I still just work off that vibe, my little project.
Awesome, man. I love that. I love that story. So, you know, we're talking about the movement culture and practice and training, and, you know, you could even throw the word exercise in there as well. Like, you know, if we're talking about exercise as maybe the intention is to, you know, thrash the body so it doesn't, you know, give you problems in 20 years when you've got metabolic diseases, and it's kind of a disembodied perspective maybe. And then we talk about practice as maybe is what you were saying, having an intention, a specific intention, and not a well thought out, but a thought out intention. What do you think? You alluded to self-actualization and things like that. What do you think is your ultimate intention in your movement practice that organizes, you know, the lower levels around it?
So, I mean, with regards to the first part, I'll speak on exercise just briefly, because it's always been an interesting one for me, because it's the world that I came from, and exercise in intention. When I speak about intention, I really mean something immediate. Like, what are you doing? Your intention right now is to not even to create a podcast with a person on it. Your intention now is to listen. That's what you're doing right now. Your intention is to think and to listen, and then off the back of that, ideas will formulate. The formulation of ideas is the second intention. The creation of the podcast is maybe the third, fourth, or fifth intention, you know? So when I mean intention with regards to exercise, I would actually say in many cases, first let's define exercise. Exercise for me is the repetition of a particular task with an idea of fulfilling an end result. Now, the fulfillment of the end result is not the intention. It's maybe third, fourth, fifth level intention. It's like, you know, okay, I do that. But in many cases, what I see in my experience, what I've seen, what I've worked with in my experience, is that exercise, I'll backtrack just one little bit more just to make myself clear. Exercise is a tool. So as I said, it's a repetition. Use it as a tool in order to fulfill some, you know, intention further down the line. But the problem that happens is, because exercise is repetition, you kind of get lost in repetition. It becomes nothing. So actually, very often when people exercise with specific movements, you know, whether it's a push-up or a bicep curl, or whether it's a jump, or whether it can become mindless with no intention whatsoever. Now, in some cases, you know, the absence of intention is also very, very valuable in itself. But it's when people don't have intention in their movement, it's not the same as absence of intention. I know I'm getting really abstract and weird here, but for example, absence of intention would be what I would refer to as almost like a Zen state. This is like when someone is, like, you know, skateboarding even. You know, you pop a few ollies, you're in a Zen state. You have no intention. You're just riding. You're just going. You're blah blah blah. The beginner is full of intention. This can be very, very problematic. The beginner is so full of intention that the mind is like, oh my God, I have so many things to think about, that it interferes with you physiologically. You become blocked by your intention, which is why one of my martial arts teachers says, you know, in the beginning, you have to start with intention. You have to intend to do something. But then ultimately down the line, you want to do that with no intention. It's the same thing, again, I use just because Yuri was in my mind. When he speaks about hand balancing, he's like, yeah, of course, there's so many, you have to stay concentrated when you're hand balancing, but ultimately you want to be able to think of nothing or anything else, because it doesn't need intention. It just happens. It is embodied. This is when you come to the part you're like, Bruce Lee, I do not kick, it kicks. But it's embodied. Your body knows it. Differentiation between mind memory, remembering a movement, and then body memory. It lives in the body. You don't think about how to ride a bike. It's body memory. It will stay there. Arguably, this is an intention, ultimate intention of certain types of movement practice, to then have these movements embodied. This is something else. But then with regards to when people are doing just exercise, and I'm talking about in the context of things such as the fitness industry, you might see in the, in your local gym, just normal stuff, that there is no real intention there at all, not even like a Zen intention. And the reason I can see there's no Zen intention, for example, is because like there is physiological angst in response to the movement. And what I mean by physiological angst is like you're doing something, it's like, and it's like if there was Zen intention there would be an open tunnel of experience between yourself and the movement. And you would be experiencing the movement for what it is, as opposed to the ideology of the experience of the movement. So what does that mean? The ideology of the experience of the movement is I'm doing push-ups, I'm on the 20th rep, therefore it is difficult, therefore I exert these when things get hard, because that's what you do when you're tired, right? But I think if you find, normally when you get someone who's like, you're just like, hey, relax your face. And normally it's just like, and it becomes lighter, it becomes easier. And then you're actually having a direct experience with the movement, not with the in-between, ideology of I'm doing bench press, therefore it's very, very difficult. Of course, I'm not talking, I understand that there are certain physiological mechanisms you can take advantage of to make your practice experience different. You can work with breaths, you can psych it up, use this, I can make my hair stand on end just by thinking of this. This is what I can use. But if I use it for a purpose. It's not just, oh my God, I'm exercising, now it's like, everything is so tight, So with exercise, this is what I very often see. There is a lack of mindfulness in the way that you're moving. And why? Because it's not about movement. It's about 1 + 1 = 2, which is, for example, push-up plus run equals fat loss. And this is an ideology. This is what we believe, just the way that we very often, still popular today. Yeah, I eat fat, I get fat, right? And it's like, if I eat less fat, I won't get so fat. And if I eat a Snickers bar, I have to go for a run because then I'll burn off the calories, right? You just kind of cut it off. Just cut this fat off, put an ab in there. This is this kind of very, again, this is historical, this way of thinking. And we have to remember this. It's completely historical. It has a place in time. It's not just the way things are. Very often people, myself, have thought this in the past. No, it's just like that. Do a few push-ups, the muscles get bigger, everyone thinks I'm cool. In some cases, it does work like this. But what happens is, in the process, you become very disassociated from the movements that you're actually doing. And even though you're moving, it's not about movement, which is how I can kind of is clearly describe the idea of having a movement practice. It's just an orientation towards, what is the experience of the movement, rather than the means, rather than using the movement as a means to an end. It's like, no, I'm moving right now. And in this particular point in time, I'm experiencing it. So when we're just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay, I did my 100. For me, this becomes, no intention. So even though people have an intention to beast the body, for example, if this is an intention that you have, the movement, it's not the movement itself that does that. It's more like just I just filling this with as much blood as possible, or I just want the lungs to burn. And then of course, then we just have this burning lung feeling, to somehow we make an association, again, ideological association, with I'm losing weight, or I'm getting fitter, or something like that. But it's completely abstract. It is completely abstract. How can you say that? How do you know that what you just did for the last hour did not just completely detract you from what the ultimate intention of your movement perhaps actually is. And you see this all the time. Like, again, this is nothing to say. These people, I went for a really nice hike yesterday, and the people, like, you know, running on the mountain, they're part of a running team and things like that. And a group of them went past. It's so funny because, you know, they're running and they're talking so much that, like, it's just like a babble of, like, this kind of Swiss chat just comes around. And we all noticed it. It's like, man, people were like talking so much running up this mountain. If there were intent, and I can't, of course, speak for their intention, but for example, if their intention were to improve their respiration and their ability to sustain themselves for a longer period, a better choice would be to keep your mouth closed, shut the fuck up. Now, I say that from if their intention were that. I do not know what their intention was. But in many cases, the actions that you're doing in the case of, for example, exercises in which I'm just repeating without actually having a reflective thought on it, can be the complete opposite of what you actually intend for those things to do. So with regards to my own, you know, ultimate intention, there is none. I don't think that far ahead. Yeah, sometimes people ask me, like, can you do this next Friday? It's like, man, probably, like, I mean, ask me the day before, I don't know. I try at the moment, and I'm sure this will change. Of course, I have, like, you know, plans and ideas of what the intention of my practice is, but there's a danger with that, is that you extend yourself too far into a future which is obviously uncertain. I mean, who can predict the future? You have to have direction, and it's the same with the programming that I provide. There's always direction. There's always a direction. There's always an intent. And this is, you know, the further reaching intention. But my immediate intention, I really try to keep it with the present as much as possible. I really try to keep it in the moment, you know. Be mindful of the future, but not at the expense of the present moment. Qui-Gon Jinn, Star Wars Episode 1. Yeah, we can learn a lot from these basic, really fundamental words. And so, yeah, intention, when I use it, this term, I'm normally referring to the original, the immediate intention, because everything else is normally built off that afterwards. And that's why I find that when people, and when I was involved even in exercise and using exercise, even for bodybuilding, my intention was still not necessarily in the moment. It was more abstracted. I was doing these movements, but it was in the understanding that I'm going to get something in the future. And for me now, this is not a great way to practice with the idea that you get something in the future. I mean, with two things. First of all, it's not always going to be true. Second of all, it's most definitely true. Like, if you have a certain plan, if you've thought through the way that you're practicing and you have a set out practice that you're following, for example, a mobility practice, you want to get your side splits, you want to get a double bodyweight back squat, you want to do a rings forward row, whatever it is. If you're following the process, you're going to get it. So what? So why do you even need to think about it? Like, the thinking about it is actually just some fluff that's getting in the way that it can do well to practice to detach yourself from. And what's even better is if you decide to change your mind along the way and go, actually, no, that's not important to me. I thought it was really important, but it was just because all my mates were doing it at the time and I thought it was the thing to do. Now I do not really give two fucks. Then you have no problem about just dropping it by the wayside, rather than go, no, but I've worked on this for so long. I have to, what am I going to think of myself because I didn't, stick to this, intention that I thought that I had, because it was a far-reaching intention that was beyond you, and you're should be changing over time if you're, practicing something that is self-cultivating. So yeah, I mean, with regards to intention, it's quite a big one for me, because it really was, reflecting back on what you said in the beginning about how perspectives changed through this idea of how I was practicing movement, so to speak. It was this as well, the intention, what are you trying to do? What is valuable? And this is the question that needs to be asked every day. It's not something that you can, as soon as you hit the nail on the head, if you don't move out of the way, you're going to get hit by the hammer at some point. You need to keep moving. You need to keep reanalyzing your ideas until you risk finding yourself stuck into a corner and blocking yourself in that corner. Some people will do this out of choice. As I mentioned before, sometimes I feel like, I just want to just do my own thing now. I'm not bothered about sharing or things like that. I'm happy practicing. But it has to be a conscious act. That intention needs to be acted upon every day in that particular moment.
Do you think that you could have had that intention, or do you think that you'd be as receptive to taking on that intention of being present with the movement and, you know, not thinking too far ahead and things like that, if you were at the start of your practice? Because I do notice that, you know, most advanced movement practitioners move from a more linear thinking of their practice, where they might be in a more deficit mode, where it's like, I need this, I'm not mobile, I'm not strong, I'm not these things. They practice for so long, they've got all those things, and then they start asking these higher questions. Do you think that that's like, do you think that, you know, you came into thinking like that because you started to tick off, you know, the boxes of things that you wanted to do, or the things that you were limiting you, that you were able to then, in the way of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, start to think about more, on that more abstract or conceptual, or I guess deep level about your practice, as opposed to, you know, I got into it and I'm like, this shoulder flexion is so annoying. You know what I mean? It's just an absolute deficit. I need to get that. And then as it becomes better, I'm like, maybe, you know, maybe it's not such a focus. Maybe I want to start asking questions of the shoulder that are, you know, a little bit different than what can it do for me?
Yes. So, I mean, first of all, I'll just quickly dispel the idea of, you know, advanced movement practice or hierarchies. I know these are the terminologies that are useful to it to present the idea. But again, the idea of advancement in practice, or like, you know, hierarchy of needs, so to speak, again, it comes from this really tricky type of, you know, this ideological base that we do come from when we speak about movement as a practice, because, you know, the idea of, you know, movement, a practice is always progressive, seems to be innate. And some people might look at me and go, well, yeah, why would you practice something you practice to get better? So, yeah, but I mean, there doesn't have to be the intention of it if it's just going to, you know, kind of happen. So I prefer to use the word exploration, because it's just open. It's just like, yeah, I'm just exploring around and checking it out. And when you really get digging into something, when you find something on exploration, then you investigate. You explore, you find something, you investigate. And this kind of ties in nicely well to the way that I found that a lot of my practice has developed. In some cases, yes, it was the case that I was like, wow, this range is really, really restricted. I need to kind of dig into that. So for example, if it were the case, I'll use my case from me, shoulder instability. Suffered so many shoulder injuries, both as a result of, you know, trauma impact, as well as training injuries or sustained during the act of practicing. And this led me to ask the question, okay, like, I need to sort these shoulders out, you know. Then it comes down to the very kind of mechanical level. I need to do my research. I need to look at the papers. I need to look at the methodology that's being used by other people from both the scientific community and also people, you know, that I trust, people I work with, people like colleagues, I mean, and even sometimes students as well, will share valuable things with me. And then plug it into the practice, the physical practice. And then this is, again, this kind of, you know, becomes training. And then very likewise, something like stability training for something like the shoulders, strength and stability training for shoulders, when you suffer from something such as hypermobile shoulders, such as myself, suffer from it, when you just have hypermobile shoulders, such as myself. This is when something like the mindfulness and the intention really comes into play, because I was doing some of these drills, man, in the past, like no intention, just like, yeah, I'm doing this, it's making my shoulder better, you know, realized a year later, and it was like, wow, okay. So that was probably the thing that made my shoulders even more hypermobile than they were, because that idiot back then, myself, didn't even question what they were doing. They just assumed, oh, this is written on their stability or something. Oh yeah, it helps the shoulder. Not without analyzing, actually, no, what is my individual issue? And this then becomes, of course, the responsibility of the individual entirely. So yeah, I was irresponsible towards myself. I did not do the research that should have been required. I did not understand the intricacies of, you know, all right, if I'm doing this a lot over time, This is going to have a physiological effect. What is that physiological effect going to be? Is it going to be the desired physiological effect that I am thinking it's going to bring? In many cases, in some cases, you can only really know after you've done it for a certain amount of time. But in many cases, you can look at literature, you can look at, basic kind of mechanics and see what's happening with this movement to go, no, that's not going to help stabilize my shoulder because, for example, it's passively stretching in this range and I'm not using strength. So that would be like a basic go-to. So if I was working with shoulder stability, I would, this is what I do personally. I try to find a variety of different frames. I try to analyze the problem and go, okay, what is it that's creating the instability in what positions in the shoulder? Is it a case of like there's weakness in internal rotation? Is there something structural that I can't really do much about? Is there something in there that I need to be quite sensitive towards maybe I shouldn't be using these particular movements to develop that at this particular point in time? Is it more rotator cuff related? Is it to do with the surrounding musculature? Is it to do with structural imbalance? Do I need to hypertrophy something? Do I need to weaken something, so to speak, to generally help unify the structural strength in that joint? So yeah, I would use certain specific tools to those ends, and that would then be research projects. Like for me, injury has been like the most influential thing for researching into many of the movements and tools that I share with people to this day that help progress them either through rehabilitation or to prehabilitate, to further strengthen the articulations for the practice that they're doing. So yeah, that would be kind of like phase one. The first thing is I'm going to look into what could be mechanically the issue. But I normally will always combine it with a movement context. And this is very, very important for me because I'm not like a big fan of measurability in terms of like reps and weights and stuff. I did that in the past. Some things, reps and weights are a useful measure, but for me, it just puts my mind into the wrong mindset. I don't, to be honest, really care how much weight I did or how many reps I did. This is still very difficult to get past. Of course, sometimes you want to put a bit more. I can lift more. I can do more. But this is something that is ultimately in the grand scheme of things, it's not really conducive to your practice. It does feel good though. So I would use a context, like for example, one of them for developing my pike compression was the context of and shoulder extension. I decided, okay, let's just choose the wild frame. So I choose a frame. The frame is going to be full manner to press handstand. Cool. So that means if I want to do a full manner to press handstand, I need to have compression. I need to pick up my compression. I need to pick up my shoulder extension. Press handstand stuff isn't really a problem. So it's just the patterning that's required. Or is it the patterning? Is it that I need more compression? But then surely if I'm doing a pike pull through, so my hands are on the floor and I've got to pull myself through, surely I also need to do head to toe. And I can't really do head to toe, honestly yet. So now I need to take out head to toe. I need to practice at a different little project that goes. Head to toe is now whirring in the background. Press handstand stuff doesn't really need to do. I just do whatever. I just do some normal stuff for that. And then I have to invent movements to target a certain portion, the sticky part in the movement, So it's like, okay, so this is the point where it's, it's getting stuck. Because when you use something, I mean, if you don't know what the hell I'm talking about, press, if I'm working with a manner, so if I'm up in manner now, I need to then pull myself through here, okay? And the sticky point was always like, like how the fuck do I get past that? So then I would look into that piece, try to develop movements, again, back to exercises. Try to create the tools to develop that specific area in that specific movement context. Just as like, for example, if I want to do like a certain spinal wave movement with here, like first I need to go, okay, there's a head needs to be able to move first. Okay, now theoretically, if I can move this head like this, it means if I can just work with the keeping the head still and the opposite idea, then if the torso just moves, but then you have to create an exercise for that so you can tie that in with that. So you kind of lock down these small little pieces to define them, and then take them out, then you work on those little bits, and then you plug it back in. I'm a very big fan of like the idea of plug out, plug back in. I use it with movement games as well. You're playing a movement game, it's like, okay, every guy, like footwork is clearly important in this. We're going to plug out, do some footwork. Not that this footwork is going to make you great. It's like, no, it just brings your attention to your feet, do some footwork, plug it back in, see what happens. So this is generally what I would do with if I was focusing on something specific, such as it was the shoulders, I would always plug it then into a larger frame. And the larger frame itself can also be, it doesn't have to be a specific movement necessarily. It can be, for example, just how you feel. Like sometimes you just don't, it's like this shoulder's just not been just feeling. Sometimes you speak to people, no, it doesn't hurt, but it just doesn't feel right. So rather than the reps and sets and the weights, I prefer to go by the subjective feeling. Like, do I feel confident with this? Like some days it's just like, I don't even really feel like I want to go into like bridging movements today because I just feel a bit rickety. For me, this is more of an accurate way to go by if you have developed a sensitivity towards yourself and how you can move and how you feel in that moment, to be able to then judge measurably, even though it's a subjective context, and measurably, you know, yeah, okay, if I had to say in a specific area about like a 7 out of 10 today, or no, I'm feeling good, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10. But in many cases, it's more like, well, I put an extra 5 kilos on the bar, I must be feeling good today, where, you know, but then from a movement perspective, of course, in one field, yeah, you're working great. But then from another perspective, it might be, yeah, but, you know, your back's really, really hurting. And the interesting thing is really great. I say, a friend of mine, basically my brother, every time I go back, I'm going to tie this in with something nice, which is meaningful sentience, another great word. But anyway, we always used to train back in the day a bit together when we were into bodybuilding. He still does more like bodybuilding type training, and he's a fisherman. He fishes with my brother. They work on the deck. They pulled on board the other day a 220 kilogram tuna. Yeah, it's massive 220 kilo tuna. But in any case, so he's quite big and stuff. He works on the deck, and he was telling me about like how much he's deadlifting and how good his training is feeling and how he's concentrating. And he has what I call meaningful sentience. He's come to this point where, you know, the pump and these really nice small things. And then he always proceeds to tell me afterwards about how much he can deadlift. He can't sweep the deck of the boat because it hurts when he uses the brush. You know, so it's just like, okay, that's like some wild, you're talking about how much you deadlift and how strong you feel and things like that because of the weight on the bar, but then the subjective experience isn't enough to tell you that something's fucking you up in your practice. So even when the subjective experience is screaming at you, like I've had in the past, you know, in the past I've been there like doing pull-ups, my forearms, tendons burning. I'm like, nah, it's like I did a few extra reps, it's great. So this is also why in many cases, when I say, you know, the intention of exercise, because you're concentrated on something in the future, the stimulus of the present, even if it's screaming at you, saying, you need to stop doing this right now, you don't do it because it's like, yeah, I got one more, just one more, just one more. In some contexts, this will help you. Most contexts I've generally found it does not. So yeah, one last thing I want to tag onto the end of that, the experience that my friend had with his bodybuilding practice and things like this, he was actually speaking about what I would call coming to a point of like zero intention in in the bodybuilding practice, by which I basically mean is he's talking about doing the movement and feeling the muscle fibers break, feeling the blood go into there, feeling a slight twist and a contraction, how it affects you. Feel the skin stretch, sweat leaks from your face, the blood is flowing, you know, the chalk against the bar, the grip is different, you feel the grooves. This is what I call like a meaningful sentience. This is actually, again, when you talk about, you know, when you ask these higher questions and things like this of yourself, no, I think this is generally in many cases that there has to be like an inquisitive nature of the individual there as well. As much as I say the practice itself will cultivate things in you, most people who come to a more movement type of practice have a certain way of thinking. They're inclined towards a way of thinking that will make them ask questions. So for me, this was like one of the earliest things. And I even wrote about it back in the day. I got stuff like maybe 15 years old that I wrote poems and creative writing, which was more what I was writing back then. And I had this idea of meaningful sentience, which is because the idea at the time is that the built body, the image of the built body is essentially an empty sign. It's a sign of the fall of masculinity. It is hiding, it simultaneously reveals and conceals the fact that masculinity is a construction. This was one kind of point of view. So you build these huge muscles to go, look, this is a man, like this is where we go. But then it simultaneously reveals the fact that it's gotten to a point in historicity where the hard masculinity no longer exists. It doesn't work. You know, it breaks down. You know, if someone threatens your masculinity and you punch them in the face, this is not how we can function like that. Hard masculinity doesn't work. It needs to be pliable. Gender, and goes to the point now where gender, however the arguments are, that however it's constructed, it's fluid. You can work with it as we like. It's malleable. So I then argued, no, there is meaning in this. There is meaning, because how can there not be meaning in a practice if there's so many people that are invested in it? And yeah, it is like a practice, the idea, I'm speaking about muscle building in general now, not just bodybuilding. There is something that draws people to it on a very, very superficial level in the initial instances. But what you'll find is when you speak to these people who have been in that type of practice for a long time, it's the feeling. It makes you feel a certain way. You have a connection to the visceral. You have visceral access to the body, which in very many times can be lost. It's like the visceral is like, I can feel this sensation that something is almost going to explode, and I'm here right now in this time, right? This is what it is. So this is, even though some people, there's another fine line between this idea that people are just exercising and there's nothing in it, but at the same time, sometimes if people are exercising, if they have like a connection to what I call the meaningfulness of their sentient being as a corporeal entity, this flesh, this blood, that it shits, it pisses, it sweats, it stinks, when we can have more of a connection to this as well, this brings something very, very meaningful and fulfilling. And it was no coincidence that when I go back and I visit my friend and he speaks to me about these things, he's specifically referring to this. And he's now he has 2 kids, and he's now 30, 33, 34. And it's only in, even though he still has a very, very simple, I say simple practice, but like a very, basic specific practice, it's taken him, he's been training now for as long as I have, but just in that field, it's taken him now like 15 years or more to start appreciating that. Now, I was personally appreciating that like after 2-3 years of practicing this stuff. Not to say I was more advanced or anything like that, but I was more inclined to just try to find something more. Like there's something more in it. It's not a conscious of there's got to be more to this. It's just like, there's always something, there's something extra. I can feel this physical sensation. From the initial instance, it's almost like from a training perspective. It's like, okay, when I do this, it feels harder. Harder normally equals I'm going to get a better physiological adaptation if I train this way in the long run. Not always true, of course. But this is what brought my attention to these sensations in the beginning. And then you start to become very curious towards these sensations. And then ultimately, as time goes on, I think it's something that the practice becomes almost about that sensation. You try to bring yourself to have that subjective experience. Like, how does it feel when I'm practicing this particular movement? Yeah, that would just be very, very basic on the level of this meaningful sentience idea. So, I mean, starting from that, the questions that come further on when you're developing your practice, if you're, you know, as you mentioned, kind of moving on to kind of more advanced things, I think it's just a continual questioning. That's why I say it's not really advanced, because anyone can choose to question in different areas. Some people would go perhaps straight from bodybuilding and then start to ask questions about their psychology, and they might find themselves immediately in a meditative type practice. So it's just a continual asking of questions. And I think what happens with this idea, to tie back, of the moving without intention, is when people stop asking questions. They stop being reflective. And this is when, you know, mindfulness turns into mindlessness, mindless action. And in all honesty, nothing really good comes from mindless action, unless you just a cog in a machine. Mindless action, normally, if it's being unquestioned, can lead to bad stuff. I mean, you can see this on a political level as well, when people just get used to stuff and it's like, yeah, right, yeah, definitely. Didn't think about it again, just that was the thing to say. So yeah, rather than, you know, it's been described, Ido spoke about like climbing a ladder of memes, with regards to gradually exposing yourself and developing a greater understanding of, you know, what it means to have a movement practice or a movement perspective, or just generally with regards to the subject in general. Yeah, I can understand this idea and I ascribe to it in a way, but I'm always wary of presenting stuff with regards to levels and ladders and hierarchies. Of course, it's just a necessary terminology and it can be a really nice terminology to use. But, you know, there is no difference between the value that, you know, an advanced movement practitioner finds in certain projects to someone who's just started doing, like for example, a 4-2-1 push-up, which is a tempo push-up, 4 seconds down, 2 second hold bottom. If they are really experiencing that in that moment, that can be like a mind opener for some people. I remember when I was first introduced to tempo in movement, and I was like, wow, like my experience has changed completely. So it's a questioning, it's a continual questioning, not necessarily kind of a leveling. It's the ongoing exploration, it's the ongoing investigation.
I'm really interested to chuck a bookmark right there, but I do want to dig into a bit on the lower body side. And I want to ask you about how you think about developing the lower body. Here's a 3-part question. How do you think about developing the lower body? What do you think the lower body is for? What are you developing it for in your perspective? And what do you see people most missing in their kind of lower body training, if you take a generalized perspective of the whole community of people that trains or moves?
Cool. I hope you've written those 3 down, because like I won't remember them, and as you've probably seen already, normally I answer one part and I forget another part. So feel free to jump back in when you want me to pick back up on it again.
How do you think about it, and how do you think about it? What's the goal of it, and what are people missing?
So could you just repeat the first one again? The first one was how do you train the lower body, or
how do you think about going about training the lower body, and what's the goal of what are we trying to do with the lower body?
Yeah,
that kind of combined
cool.
question.
Yes, I mean, from the outset, I will express that I don't propose, or I don't ascribe to the idea of lower body. We just train the lower body, we train the upper body, blah blah blah. I do it as a point of programming. It's convenience for programming. So, for example, with the online support or other programs I've written where I write lower body complexity, it's purely for the intention of programming. That's it. It's convenient. So that's out of the way. I don't try to split, because there's ultimately, we're going to be moving with everything. And one needs to complement the other, which is something that has to come into mind further down the line. In many cases, this can be tied into posterior chain mobility, the importance of posterior chain mobility, being able to touch your toes, your feet, your hands to the ground, basically, because ultimately, if I want to be using patterns or moving in ways that involve the whole body, if I'm in a standing position, one of the methods of bringing myself down to start using the whole body is to bend forward. So of course, if I'm extremely lacking in the posterior chain, if I can't even pike and touch the hands flat to the floor, I'm going to be hugely restricted in that, in the beginning. So that's how then the idea of actually tying together upper and lower body to just, moving through the space with particular patterns can then bring you back to, okay, what do I need to train? I need more posterior chain mobility because it's affecting me, and then plugging it back in, just as I mentioned with, for example, the context of the pike pull through from manner into press handstand. So with that out of the way, the lower body, what is the lower body for? The lower body is for whatever the hell you want it to be for. Yeah. Again, this is the responsibility of the individual to decide A, what they want it for, B, what they need it for. So it can be two different things. For example, if you are if you work in the military, you're going to have a very specific function for your legs. In many cases, you're probably going to have to be able to walk carrying a heavy load for a long time. You're also going to be able to have to, crawl, things like this. So there's certain complex movements with the legs and patterns, kind of a waste of your time unless you just want to do it for yourself. So we could then speak about the idea of functionality, but we always have to, when we speak about functionality, it must be with the context. Time and time again, I hear, functional this, functional. There's nothing wrong with the word functional, but it has to be functional for. Finish the sentence. Or again, we just end up with these words that we throw around like fitness, movement, yeah, just move. And it's like, no, think about it. Like, what are we doing? Because it had to translate to a physiological action, and those physiological actions have physiological consequences. So it must be thought through. In general, what I personally promote with a lower body practice is an experience of complexity and intensity. It's very much inspired by just something that Ido passively said, I think in a workshop, but maybe even a podcast as well. The idea that the shoulders crave complexity and the hips crave intensity, to paraphrase, and working from this idea, because normally it's based around, at the time, in this particular workshop, it was based around work we were doing with the gymnastics rings as a tool of choice for developing the complexity of the upper body, or at least working with that idea of the upper body being complex, or the shoulders being complex, sorry. But then the lower body, lower body as well, surely it can be complex. We have these massive legs kicking around here. People can do crazy stuff with their legs, whether that's patterns, whether that's open chain things, waving them around, lifting it up by your head, flipping it about, kicking someone in the face, tripping someone up, or whether it's walking through space, spinning on the toes, whether it's a pirouette, things like this, creating connect potential, all these types of things that you can do with the legs. So they are obviously very complex limbs. We can't forget about them. Coming from my personal background of which was more kind of a bilateral strength practice from legs, back squats, front squats, some lunging stuff, but always bilateral. The first thing that I highlighted when I started bringing myself away from just, hypertrophy based training, this is a lie, actually, an outright lie. When I was bringing myself away just from weight training, when I was just like, no, fuck weights, man. Like, I'm going to go and do body weight training, this kind of like switch in mentality to become the body weight guy. Yet in any case, of course, there was intensity lacking. And I was like, how can I get intensity in body weight training without using weight? The obvious thing was unilateral. Start working unilaterally. So I started unilateral leg training from the perspective just of this, like, I'm not allowed to use weights because like I'm in the body weight camp now. So what do I do? Okay, so I start learning how to pistol squat. Stood myself up on a breeze block with knees wrapped around my knees, wasn't able to squat down below 90 degrees. That's where I started. But after some time, quite thankfully, I started to realize that unilateral intensity, we can talk about intensity in terms of 1 rep max, which as far as I use the term, this is what I use the term for, essentially the intensity with regards to your 1 rep max. Yeah, it was intense. I might be able to, just do a few reps on the leg, which is, near maximal intensity. But then when I did eventually go back to the context of a back squat, my back squat dropped from 120 kilo for reps down to 65. And this was 2 years. I didn't back squat for 2 years. I didn't back squat for 2 years. I didn't touch a weight for 2 years, as I would say in this time. But in any case, I realized immediately that the intensity of unilateral training is not the same as the intensity as training with an external load. Quite obviously, because there's a much greater demand on the nervous system when you're dealing with an external load, because there's much more of the entire body involved. When you're working with a unilateral squatting pattern, you are not supporting an excessive load. It's body weight. And you can also use mechanical advantage much to your advantage. There's very many ways of getting around it. You try to use mechanical advantage when you've got double body weight on your back. Someone call an ambulance for you afterwards. But so intensity is something that I do plug into the perspectives that I share on lower body complexity. It's an integral part. Very often, more commonly now, people come, they want to speak with me to enter into the program, and they're trained individuals doing all this kind of nice work. Their strength and mobility seems okay. And then I'll ask them about their back squat, and it's like, I don't do it. I've either never done it, or I did it a few times in the past and I never really got on with it, which means I didn't practice it enough. And I don't do it. And for me, that's like, man, like, not like, oh, you have to back squat, but more the case of this context is valuable. It is an experience of stress. It's an experience of nervous stress on your body. Can you cope with stress? If someone comes to you and go, mate, you've got 100 pages to write 2 weeks time. What are you going to do? You're going to shit your pants, or you're going to open your laptop and you're going to start writing. Someone goes, right, we need someone to take the shift from tonight. Like, needs to be you. No one else is available. And you've been there for like 2 weeks in the job. What are you going to do? You just, oh my God, I crumble. Some people will crumble. Some people will stop, freeze, even cry. And then the person requesting will realize, okay, this guy cannot handle stress. However, if you have experience with stress, it doesn't mean you have to, bro out and work on your rep max every time, but know where you are, know where your crumbling point is, know what you can and cannot do. And then in the future, if you wish to make that a project in which, okay, I want to increase that weight a little bit more, I think it would be an interesting experience to follow a type of pathway that would lead to that. That is always there. When you close yourself up to it completely, just because you either never learned it, or you're essentially scared of it because it's a heavy weight and you don't know how to do it. Nothing wrong with being scared of it. I'm shit scared when I went boxing. I still am every single time I go. But like, at least if you are interested in movement, those contexts, as Ido mentioned again, this kind of idea of X marks the spot, those contexts are the one that are going to give you a huge value in return. And there's nothing special about it. It's more the idea you don't have experience. Dan John said it once, it was really nice. He's like, when people come to me, like track and field athletes, and they say to me, oh, John, I need to get like more power in my general body. First thing he'll say to them is, you're doing farmers walks? And they'll be like, no, I'm not. He's like, look, do farmers walks. Like the blah, 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 he'll give them the program, and then they'll come back a few months time and go, Jan, those farmers walks, man, they're amazing. Like my power's gone up, stuff like this. And he'll be like, no, it's not the farmers walk. It's just the fact that you weren't doing farmers walks. That's it. There's nothing special about the farmers walk. It's just, if you weren't doing it, it's going to contribute so much. So for me, this is very, very important that I share this with people, this idea. So I program in the very beginning something. I would never put someone who hasn't been familiar with using a back squat into a back squat context, because I understand that not only physiologically are they perhaps not prepared, psychologically are perhaps not prepared as well. And the thing is with back squat, with weighted, loaded movements in general that are for developing strength, in the absence of a certain amount of load, the mechanics aren't really done justice. You know, you can kind of sway about unless you've got like at least body weight on the bar. And I wouldn't want to put someone straight under body weight on the bar who's not confident or is expressed in confidence at doing that. So we work on other frames first, usually just very basic hinging. We won't even work with deadlifts first of all. We'll just work with slow eccentric Romanian deadlifts normally. Sometimes, depending on the individual, sometimes as slow as like a 6-4, 6-4-1-1 tempo. So they'll come down for 6, they'll hold and map that position for a 4 count, and then come up, lock out at the top. And one of the reasons for that as well is because it will also prevent them from losing too much weight in the initial instance, because they get, you know, that tempo. And the great thing is they experience stress with that tempo, because it's a stressful tempo to hang out 4 seconds in that hinge position with a neutral spine. And if they've shown proficiency in doing that, then when we drop the tempo, so for me, a standard tempo for the Romanian deadlift, because I also use it as part of a loaded stretch as well, would be like a 4-2-1-1 tempo. So when they start just going down for 4 and holding for 2, they're like, oh, this is a breeze. So by the time I set them and like, okay, right, you can use just dumbbells because the dumbbells are more movable. You can fit with your movement pattern more. I'm personally a huge fan of like really heavy dumbbell Romanian deadlifts, beauty. I'll just put them on dumbbell and I'll give them something like a 2-0-1-1. And they're like, oh, what? I don't even have an isometric pause in the bottom anymore. And by that point, they're confident because they've spent the time. And this might be like after a year, 9 months or a year, it might be. We don't run through this stuff quickly. That's how I would expose people generally to the idea of the intensity in the lower body practice. Now, the complexity part is first of all just based around really basic, I say, unilateral, leg strength movements that also request mobility from you, either in order to achieve the task, or either it will do it as well through the action of doing the task as well. So, for example, one very common thing I use is a single leg reach. Very often misconstrued for a single leg of Romanian deadlift. It's not, because we perform it with a locked knee. It's a very specific reason for a locked knee, because I also maintain in my mind, again, through application of certain concepts, such as the shoulders, if they crave complexity, then surely the hips may also crave complexity. The idea of, okay, we talk about straight arm strength. I mean, who's talking about straight leg strength? But it's there. Open chain straight leg strength is there. Closed chain straight leg strength is there. The open chain stuff you see with the ballerinas and martial artists kicking. And this is open chain. Sorry, not with the martial artists, but with ballerinas, for example, the lifting of the legs. And also with closed chain, something like a straddle up, coming up from the floor with straight leg, things like this. And essentially, I'm not the one to talk about physiological adaptations from the point of view of a scientific perspective. I'm not that guy. Yeah, I read my PubMed things and things like that, my own stuff in my brain. Someone can call my bullshit on me, and I'd be very, very happy to listen, because I'd probably learn something. But I just share what I've kind of looked into and the perspectives that I have. And one of them is being that stability with a straight leg position. Very many people that I work with, they cannot perform a unilateral reaching movement. So it's basically, I'm standing up here now, I've got the leg completely locked out, and I'm reaching straight forward here. If you would turn it out into more of a position, an arch position, it would be more like the arabesque in ballet. It's not really, that's not what we use it for. But they're unable to straighten the knee. The knee cannot be straightened. And you know what will happen? I'll then look at their handstand practice, and they can't knock the knees out. And what happens when they can't knock the knees out? They can't knock the knees. They have to compensate by piking in the hips. And with the piking in the hips, they compensate by arching in the back. And the arching in the back compensates by closing in the shoulders. And the other way around. Closing in the shoulders results in arching in the back, arching in the back in order to balance, piking in the hips in order to rebalance the other way, flexion in the knees. So you'll see it throughout the entire practice. This person cannot straighten their legs. And again, it would be like a trained individual, and it's like, you can't knock your legs out. And again, I know this because I reflect on all my videos that I've recorded myself, and I look at those videos and I go, why the fuck can't I straighten my knees? And then I do the same thing again. And this ties back into what I said with about finding the nuances in these movements, the tipping of the shoulder, the X point for the biceps, or you keep it here, don't rest in the bottom position. When I then started to, okay, I'm going to do all my compression routines over again for new phases. And I'm going to truly lock these legs out. And you know what? The physiological sensation, the meaningful sentience, what you feel, completely different. If you completely lock, truly, honest to God, lock your knees out and you're performing a compression routine, it will go right up to the top of the quads. It will burn, and after a few weeks, you will notice this muscle popping out of the top of your quadricep just because of extra tonus in there. It's not like hypertrophied in that time, but just extra tonus in there. So these are things that, with regards to lower body complexity, are all part and parcel of that. So in the absence of I'm doing this for a particular context in the way that I would present it, straight leg strength as an idea, the intensity, and then we come to patterns. The patterns that you can make with your legs, very simple ideas, and there's certain types of crossing. It can be in the context of a dragon squat. We then work with the context and also then the subject of low gait, the exploration of low gait, working with patterns through low gait. And that then brings you then into entering the floor. And then we find ourselves more connecting with the world of things like locomotion. This is when subjects start to cross and floor communication. So in the center of the subject, you have these core things. We have these certain types of unilateral movements. We have loaded mobility work. We have other certain mobility work that's going on. We have, ankle, knee, toes, pre-habilitative movements. We have context that will test the how those particular joints have been prehab. So if you're able to perform this movement for the certain amount of reps, given the prerequisites that we've fulfilled, then okay, we don't really need to do any more prehab work for toe extension, etc., etc., etc. I can now cross that off the list. You're done with that, project finished. We'll bring it back maybe in like a year or something. So that prehabilitative aspect is in there as well. Then when we start moving along the floor, the 90-90 position, which starts as something very, very basic from, for example, just working with the 90-90 and rocking, hip upping, switching. But ultimately, I want to be able to drive this car. Again, there's another nice term that was taken from Ido, just being able to use those patterns. So for example, I've introduced this in workshops a few times, and I've had the instances that we've looked at these patterns. I've introduced these patterns. I've said, okay, you can use your hands to come up. You can use them to move around. We look at some specific patterns, and then we'll use a context in which, okay, a person is standing in front of you, and you just have to always face towards their front. And people, I shit you not, like even going through this, I've done this with dancers, like really, really great dancers. And they're like, they don't know how to get from, they don't have a terminology to get from here to there. You can lift your leg up by your head and all this, but I can't move to that point. And they absolutely stump. I've literally almost had people quit, which is a bad place. You don't want to bring people to that point where I've had people almost shut down on me because they cannot believe that they can't move along the floor using their legs in a complex way 1 meter. They don't know how to move. They're stuck. So this is a vocabulary that I try to develop with people, an ability to move in contact with the floor. And the 90-90 position is a really, really great context to begin with, because it starts really at that basic level. And ultimately we move on to, improvisation. I want to see you just moving along the floor using these different patterns, traveling patterns, switching patterns, rocking over patterns, hip lifting, coming back down again. So this is then how that subjective lower body complexity, on a programming perspective, we might start with these basic 90-90 exercises, these smaller contexts within the lower body complexity, but then the actual floor contact stuff and moving would then be filtered in through to their the floor communication practice. If they're not doing a floor communication practice, I can still keep that in the lower body complexity into that subject, which is again why I say that I use lower body complexity as a term, not as this is lower body complexity, and it always crosses over at the fringes. So yeah, we have a floor contact, we have loaded mobility, we have, of course, prehabilitation and where necessary rehabilitation of the articulations for the lower body as well. And yeah, what was one of the other things that we did with lower body complexity? No, I mean, in all honesty, if I'm presenting these ideas and I say this is the way that I propose it to be done, and I'm programming it, I should give of course, a reason why I choose it and what it actually kind of leads to. So I will, and in many cases, and this goes for the entirety of the physical practices that I program for people, is this very, very simple idea of exploring and developing your physical movement potential. In the application of what is up to you. I'm not going to tell someone, hey, you need to go to the climbing wall because you need to start applying some of this stuff. But ultimately, the end of the day, I want people to be applying this into a context. I would like people to apply it into a context so they can basically see what they're building in action, see what they're practicing in action. Now, there is also nothing wrong with just maintaining your interest just to your physical practice, just to developing the capacities and developing the potentials. There's nothing wrong with this. I just kind of find it a bit of a shame, which is what I did for years. And in all honesty, I've only started really doing this in the past couple of years, is actually then applying my physical potentials to certain disciplines or fields or contexts that are not within the realm of my own practice, of my physical practice. So yeah, I want people, I program them in such a way that I hope that they can go to a practice and then see, wow, like I can actually hold myself well physiologically with these other people who've been practicing this for years, because my physiological capacities are way beyond theirs. I'm just shit and don't know anything about this discipline. So, and then that's the thing that that would then be the practice, I started speaking a lot more about kind of applied movement context, which basically just means that, okay, you can do like some muscle ups and stuff. There's a tree. How many different ways can you pull yourself up and over it? That's kind of the task. Now apply those things in a particular context. The wider applied movement context would be, for example, okay, you've got some leg strength and things like this, some complexity with developed. Does it serve you, for example, in like capoeira or floor work in jiu-jitsu? Can you actually move and get away from someone? Can you get your feet inside someone inside to protect yourself or to create space or something like this? Does it actually function? This would be where I would like to say that the practice brings people. Now, I haven't been running the program. I mean, it's been going for like 3 years or more to then say, oh yeah, this specifically helped this person in this field, blah, 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 blah. I'm not really in the place of saying, okay, I'm going to make you completely better at your sport and things like that. I kind of subscribe to this idea of okay, if we just improve these things, they should have the most general effect on your whatever practice you choose to enter yourself into. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the lower body complexity aspect. And the second two questions you asked off the back of that, I hope I answered, but if not, I'm happy to dig into as well.
No, you did, man. That was perfect. That was good. I've also seen your work with stomach vacuuming and some of the work with the diaphragm and the breathing. And, I haven't seen that much about that in amongst the other movement practitioners that I follow. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit about, the stomach vacuuming and the breathing and diaphragmatic work that you teach or explore as well.
So it starts always with curiosity if I'm digging into something new, and in many cases curiosity for the physiological aspect of things. I never started breathing and diaphragm work from a perspective of meditation or a perspective of well-being or a perspective of even breathing. Never even approached it as a matter of of many other things it's associated with. I was interested, first of all, in the stomach vacuum from bodybuilding. I used to practice it in the days of bodybuilding. It was used as an aesthetic tool. But what I soon realized when I was practicing it for this purpose is that in order to hold a stomach vacuum, you also have to be able to hold your breath without inhaling. You have to exhale and you have to hold your breath. and it's just something completely new. It's just like, I run out of breath within like 10 seconds. Over time, this started to develop. It just started to become easier. I was able to hold my breath for longer. I wasn't doing it full breath holding, but I noticed these things. And then some years later, where I started researching the material, when I started kind of exploring a little bit more, when I started seeing things from other people, again, I was still approaching it from the perspective of physiological manipulation. I was approaching it and practicing from the perspective of muscle control, which is really nice because it's also the name of what's his name, the brother of Swami Yogananda, who is the founder of which yoga style is that? Ashtanga yoga. He was a bodybuilder. He was a bodybuilder and a yoga practitioner from influence of his brother. And actually, he would use these techniques of muscle control and things like this as part of his bodybuilding practice for muscle control. Because one of their perspectives of bodybuilding that they were practicing was, the more you can control a muscle, the more you can develop a muscle. It was like mind muscle connection, basically. And actually, he passed many of those techniques to his brother, Swami Yogananda, who then brought them to the West, in the 60s when they were coming over and sharing these yoga practices, but then of course having to develop some kind of physical system so that Westerners can relate to it. Westerners couldn't really relate to, okay, let's just sit down and meditate and practice this. It's like it had to come through this kind of physiological practice. So this was kind of the perspective that I found myself in, just practicing for muscle control. And then doing more research, I started to come into contact with, for example, Buteyko breathing, which is a Russian system of breathing, which was originally developed for medical purposes to treat asthma patients. And as I was a childhood asthma sufferer, it was something that started to gather my interest when I started realizing that some of these techniques have commonalities. There's no types of abdominal manipulation in Buteyko breathing. However, the mechanism that is required to hold the breath also will create the same circumstances under which the body builds a tolerance towards carbon dioxide, which then allows you to essentially respire better through your cells and uptake the oxygen better and get it delivered to where it needs to go at that particular time. So this is essentially, how it developed. From that point there, I started to not only explore things myself, but one of my teachers that I was working with, he was very, very heavily working with breathing practice, again, from more like a Russian tradition, speaking also about Buteyko and things like this and the Bohr effect and this mechanism, which is essentially the work that they were doing. So for example, in breathing diaphragm, I said it quite explicitly that, the work we are doing, if we want to speak about it on a biochemical level, we are in the practice of developing your tolerance towards carbon dioxide because of this, that, and the third. This then started to filter into a variety of different tools that can be used to explore that, which in themselves are explorative movement scenarios, which is really, really fantastic. So you can explore, for example, ideas of tension and softness. Or the word in German is actually so much better, Spannung and Entspannung. It's like tension and non-tension. So rather than softness brings up too many things with it. But Spannung and Entspannung is like tension and then non-tension, contracting and relaxing, which is essentially the only two things that we can really do on a physiological level, contract and relax. So it's a practice of this as well. And when it's to do with tension, it's also to do with, for example, not just physiological tension, other things, psychological tensions, emotional tensions. So I kind of feel like personally that I came through the back door to what can be seen as like the potential health and wellness benefits that also come from a breathing practice. And then from that action of things like abdominal manipulation and diaphragm work, we then start tying into the ideas of blood circulation, blood flow, energy flow. You then start to see very many similarities with like certain Taoist practices for breathing. You see the similarities with, for example, like Nauli, the practice in yoga, for cleansing as a preparation for meditative practice, not as the practice itself, as just the preparation for it. And it became quite clear to me that after using these tools for some years, that there was value there again. And as I said in the beginning, it comes to a point where I'm like, okay, if I truly believe this is a value and I feel like I can contribute and provide certain context for other people that are going to bring them certain benefits, is there a responsibility to do that? The question remains open, but I took the decision that no, I want to document this. So I started with the easiest thing that I knew, which is just making resources. Resources then evolved into a package. Resources then evolved into more research and then my writing. And what I was really nice, I mean, it took me about a year to write the breathing and diaphragm package. What was really, really nice is that with myself, very often I start from the action of doing the stuff, and then I normally ask the question later. So I was doing all this practice and things like that. I noticed my bolt score was increasing. I noticed I was recovering. I noticed I could only breathe through my nose. I started going to movement workshops, and we would do very active tasks that you're not a maximal exertion, but it's sustained over a long period of time. And I noticed that everyone else, even for example, CrossFitters who, their practice is capacity training with regards to, cardiovascular as well as strength training, but they were just fucking shit out of shape. And I don't consider myself an in shape person in the traditional sense of the word. Like I'm really crappy at running and things like this, really inefficient in many cases when it comes to, cardiovascular work. But I was fine. I could keep my mouth closed. I could breathe through my nose. I was recovering really quickly. And I personally put it down to the breathing work that I consistently been doing and exploring, even though it wasn't really for that purpose. So when I started researching into more into papers from these different fields, whether it's from the Russian tradition or the Indian tradition, from the Taoist traditions, where they use breathing work as a huge part of their practice, I started to realize that the practice that I was doing was kind of being justified through what I was reading. I didn't research this stuff to okay, now I need to back up what I'm doing. I was just researching because I wanted to give people in this package also there's Western people mostly that are buying it. They like to have a scientific perspective on it. And it's not like I felt like I needed to prove it. It was more the case that I think that it had to come as part and parcel of it, because when you're dealing with breathing, you're dealing with life. And I don't want people to feel like that I provided a package just of some stuff I practiced that I saw on YouTube for a bit and thought it was cool and then repackaged it and sold it. And it's so the research for me, even though I did not need it for myself, I can feel, like I said, I had the subjective experience. I knew it was fine. It was measurable for me. It was done. I didn't need to have the research and things like that, but I did it just to present it with the material. And it was very, very interesting how many things kind of tied in that I also didn't really expect. And that gave the greater confidence for me to say, no, I think this is something valuable that I can share through this particular medium, which was the programming. I mean, breathing and diaphragm work as well is also something that's interesting when we think of it in terms of, for example, meditation, because personally, as a practitioner, I have never set out on a meditative practice. I don't have a practice in which I focus on focusing something or focus on not focusing on anything. I don't really have a practice or an intention to search for a type of emptiness. In all honesty, I've never really felt a need for it. However, again, I thoroughly believe that through the breathing and diaphragm practice that I have been doing for many years, creates the conditions under which could be seen as a meditative experience. And I think this gives a lot to me, whether it's spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, in terms of wellness, in return, without setting out with the intention of, okay, this is my meditative practice. Breathing and diaphragm was the work. That's the work. I'm working on my breathing and I'm working on my diaphragm. everything else that comes with that ultimately comes as a side effect. Because if you're breathing down to 1 breath per minute, you have to be in some type of focused meditative state to stop the diaphragm from spazzing out and putting you into a panic and feeling the neck contract. So for me, the breathing and diaphragm, because I'm someone who approaches things more on a physiological level, hence this idea of the meaningful sentience and feeling, I think this is probably why I invested so much in it and why it attracted me so much. Because it was clearly a movement exploration, so it had a direct application to a movement practice. It's a movement context. I want to know how I can physiologically manipulate the abdominals and also the diaphragm in such a way that was very superficial in the beginning. But then all these kind of other things come with it, with the ongoing practice, and of course with the other tools that are inevitably in there as well. And yeah, for breathing and diaphragm, whenever the people ask me about it, I always say, you know, look, there is years worth of material, even in this kind of package alone, just because the tools that I've been using, some of the most basic tools, the most fundamental tools, like for example, breath holding, has been serving me for years and continues to bring benefits. You can just apply it in different applications in different ways with different, you know, you can integrate the rest of the body or not. You can integrate it with movement. You can be seated. You can do it with other people. And yeah, it's just something that for me was actually somewhat not being spoken about much in the movement culture. And I feel like it's more that in many cases, because as I said, you know, it's breathing, it's life. It's very understandable to feel like you shouldn't be speaking about this unless you're qualified. Now, I had that in my past with regards to every single thing I've ever shared in my life. Like, am I qualified to do this? And at some point, you just have to say, no, what do I believe? If I can try and scrape away all the bullshit of like the ego, because of course the ego is there as well. There's probably a part of you that wants like, you know, I want to be the one that does this. But if you can truthfully, as much as you can, try to clean away that stuff and go like, okay, is this genuine? Is this pure? Do I believe it's of true value? Do I believe that I'm truly equipped in this moment to be able to contribute something without just adding to the fluff? And it was at that point with the breathing and diaphragm work. I was like, no, look, there's just some really basic stuff here that I think I can just share that is, you know, ongoing for a lifetime of benefit in general to people, regardless of their physical practice, discipline, etc., etc. And yeah, so for me, breathing and diaphragm is something that sometimes I've heard it say that, okay, how should I breathe? And people say, oh, just enough to live. It's not that important. It's like, well, man, nah, it's important. And it starts at a most basic level. Like, for example, if someone just asks me, first of all, you know, what are my perspectives, if anything I can share on breathing and diaphragm, the first thing would always be, you know, shut your mouth and save your life. I said it already, just like, and this comes from a comment from another guy, but yeah, just don't breathe so much. Something like this is not, I don't need to have a medical degree, and I don't need to have, for example, a long life-serving practice in a spiritual discipline, for example, to be able to just share that information. And then perhaps something, of course, you know, supporting that, not just shut your mouth, a few reasons and stuff why, and a quite easy way that can be implemented into practice. It would take me no more than a few minutes to explain, and then it be of value. This is why with the breathing and diaphragm, I really went in for that, because just the value that I believe that was there.
Okay, man, that's interesting. I reckon we'll touch on the concept of proofing, and then I've got a couple more kind of shorter wrap-up questions. But I am interested to hear about when you talk about proofing, you know, what do you mean and what kind of context do you explore that in?
Yeah, proofing can be, I'll talk about the initial context of proofing. It's like the context of proofing is hugely simple and the reason I say simple, I don't mean simple as in it's not complex. I mean simple in the most people who are bringing mindfulness to their movement are already doing it. And I've had this comment so many times. People are like, I do this, but like no one ever really contextualized it and put it into a way of like it's being doing. And this is useful to do because then when you say, no, it's a thing, then you can invest into it more. You create some structures to play within rather than just some kind of floating around. It's like, no, we're practicing this, and this pattern, go to work. It gives you something to get your teeth into, something to dig into deeper, something to explore. And I've seen people even then share their perspectives of how they proof for certain things, which is fantastic because they take it into their own scenario, which is what proofing should be. So to come to what proofing is, it's a checking. It's it. You're checking your ranges. What is available? What is not available? And I think this is, I almost wrote something recently about like the idea of warming up. But I kind of avoided it because it opens up too many kind of boxes that, whatever. But warming up as an example, or preparation for practice, I always begin with proofing. I have to check, what is or isn't feeling right today, because proofing is also an acceptance that daily things change. You'll feel different every single day. Your body will be different every single day. So proofing, for example, just for the spine is something you would just use to check, is anything kind of like stressed out from the way that I slept or how I've been working today? Are there perhaps any kind of like clicks and pops that need to be kind of brought out before I start, practice that might hold any undue tension and disrupt my ongoing practice? It's also quite simply as well, getting the blood moving, the synovial fluids moving, the lymph fluids moving through the body, by going through these particular motions. However, rather than just being like warm up in terms of, okay, I have to prepare this specific place for this specific movement, which I do as well, but I use different tools for that. Proofing is a more general perspective of how do I feel moving through these ranges at the moment. So it's a preparation and it's also a checking. And now normally, and for the purpose of the series that I've almost finished releasing, it's been located to what I would call the major articulations of the body. So of course, things like the wrist, the fingers, the elbows, shoulders, hips, knees, toes, blah, 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 blah. And this is also a nice way for me to go about proofing as well. So for example, once people that I work with have become proficient with certain frames that we use for exercising, moving through the squat ranges and stuff like this, I'll then put them onto just like squat proofing, and they'll have a terminology and a vocabulary they can use, an embodied vocabulary, in order to check what they need. Because of course, the ranges that they need to check through are going to be different to the ranges that I have that are often, tight or restricted at some points, or I know I just need to check into. So this is the main perspective of proofing. The idea of checking through the ranges. It's not necessarily a developmental frame in terms of developing your physiological capacities and for your strength and mobility, but that's not to say that it's not going to. So for example, in many cases, certain restrictions in the body, in my experience, they're related to the protective nature of the nervous system. And in some cases, it's a very kind of superficial restriction, which basically means if you just move through it a few times, it will generally start to release. Now, if you've got an ongoing tension, for example, in your lumbar spine that is consistently there and you haven't really been moving it, or you only move it with like a repetitive, sagittal plane, spinal wave, and you haven't really even explored moving your feet or stepping through space, or even just moving the spinal wave in a slightly different direction. Okay, you'll be able to do a spinal wave in this, in the sagittal plane, dorsal ventral and stuff, but what about lateral, for example? Even the lateral spinal wave is still a bit like, in the frontal plane, I just call it lateral because it's directional, it's lateral. But very often people not exploring this, down, up, down, the in-betweens, the circles, the spirals, and proofing just opens the space to be able to do this. It allows you to explore. It's supposed to be, as I said before, explorative and then investigative. So you explore, and then when you find something, wait a minute, then you dig into it a little bit, you check it out, and you learn something about it. And that process of finding those places which have perhaps, tension in there, that is just from superficial stuff, from stress, from just not being moved so much, over time, the practice of proofing can actually develop, the mobility of those ranges, because they're just more available. They have more experience. They're being, mapped on your cortical map, and they essentially become more available. And as a result, your movement potential is increased. You can now move. You have more potential to move for those ranges through whatever you choose to use it for. I recently also brought in my own personal mind another perspective of proofing, which is again closely in connection with I spoke about, like applied movement contexts, because there is the perspective of proofing, like, is it real? Does it work? Show me the proof. And I like to be inspired also by the terminology of words to then enact it into movement. So an applied movement context, for example, is then like, okay, I can do kind of muscle ups on a bar or something like this, or I can perform a particular movement. Okay, prove it. Where's the proof? Can you prove it in this particular context? This is something else. It's not connected with what I presented online, but it's just something I thought about recently, which I started kind of exploring a little bit myself. But yeah, when it comes to proofing, quite simply, it is that checking of those ranges, but with the intention of that. Because in many cases, when people say they've been doing it, it's just like, oh yeah, just check a bit, like, yeah, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay, good to go. It's like, now you can make it an investigation. You can spend time on that. There's value in it, but it requires that reflectivity. It requires that meaningfulness, and not, again, just that kind of like repping out and just shaking my stuff. Which is interesting because, in many cases, if I go to a class, and it's not a movement class or something, and then we do like the standard warm up that they do there, and we go through the classic, I don't know what it is, side bends, tuck, 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 yeah, just rolling the head. And then there is an inclination that, a me of the past would have been like, what's this bullshit warm up? They don't even know how to prepare the body correctly for, this idiot from the past, idiot still now. But in these contexts, I now find that I can find an appreciation of it. It's like, oh, star jumps, cool. All right, let's see what I can squeeze out of these star jumps. How can I be more poppy? How can I explode? How can I really extend to the maximum? Is there a coordination that I can improve with that? Hip circle. I'm just doing a hip circle. Okay, is there a point that's restricted in here? Is it, rather than just like, I'm just doing a hip circle? It's like, nah, if you're in a class and you may even think that for some reason the movement isn't conducive to the ongoing practice, maybe on a physiological level it's not, if you look at the practice on a piece of paper, but you can still squeeze value out of that movement context. You can still use it as an exploration. And in some cases, some of those stupid movements, I think, oh, this is such military type warm-up thing, become so interesting. I find something in it that I then bring it back into my own practice. This can happen sometimes as well. So that mindfulness with regards to proofing is also a mindfulness you can bring to these ideas of warm-ups in any types of contexts, because ultimately it's all on you. It's like how you exercise that specific exercise is completely bent on your intention. What is your intention? Do you have an intention? For me, with regards to movement, a movement without an intention, unless it's an involuntary action of the body, it can be something that's wasted. It can be an experience, the way that you're stepping, the way that you're breathing, the way that you're picking up an object. This is why I love cooking, because of these nuanced kind of movements, and you can always improve them. You can always slice a piece of garlic more thinly. You can always, peel an onion. If you want to be about the numerical value, you can always do it quicker. How many onions can you chop in like 10 minutes? Like, this is an awareness that you can bring to any type of movement. And then what this does as well, when you bring awareness to the movement, it helps disperse this idea of hierarchy, which we spoke about before. It helps disperse the idea of, nah, this is not a valuable movement. I'm just moving with the neck this. I should be doing like a full spinal wave, and it's like, nah, like if you cannot grab value out of a push-up, and I mean, this is something that you can investigate, because even a push-up can have a value in its context. It can be truly milked to. I'm talking about just a linear basic push-up. There are questions you can ask of it that are not out of the, the high and mighty expertise of the specialized, advanced movement practitioner, as he said. No one is too experienced to do a back squat. No one's experienced to do a deck squat. To squat down, roll on your back, get back up again. How does that experience work for you? Value is something that with proofing, I try to bring to those moments that, as I said, many practitioners are already doing it, but I just try to highlight, look, this can be a subject of exploration of itself, and we can call it proofing.
Awesome, man. Do you have time for one more question, or do you want to move into the final short question?
Yeah, I have time for one question. It's more if you have time for one question.
Cool, man. So this is something that I think about a lot in terms of this curiosity and how to give this to students. So, or how to encourage this curiosity or how to maybe teach it or bring it about, guide that process in some way. So how do you go about developing that curiosity and intention in your students to pay true attention and to be investigative and to pay attention?
First of all, I need to be sure that I know what I'm talking about in my own mind, which again is why, for example, experiences like this, I do self-reify as well, through writing, through speaking to myself and things like this, explaining to other people that I'm not just kind of riding off on just some wild random idea that I think is cool, but actually doesn't have any value. So be sure that you have a process and an understanding that you can explain in the form of words or writing, because this is the context we have to use, the medium we have to use, that you can explain that in a way that's not just abstract and and wish-wash and speak of essences and stuff like this. You need something concrete, what you can speak about. This is why for me the idea of intention as a word is very, very conducive to this. So I will explicate it in feedback to people quite clearly. I will say to them quite specifically why I can see that they don't have intention, because it's a very strong statement to say you don't have intention, because the other person can go, so how do you know that? It's happening in my head. But I can say, hey, look, I can see you don't have intention because of this, this, and this, this, and this. It's expressed in your movement. Because everything comes out through your movement. Your sadness, your happiness, the tensions of the body, your hopes, your wills. You can see it sometimes in people's movements. They're trying to do it, but they don't have the physical capacity. I do this all the time. I try to do a movement and then I can't actually do it, but my will is there, the intention is there. So you can see it in movement. And so I highlight it on a physiological level. One of the things I've already explained, which is very often the face. If someone's doing a movement that is not actually really that strenuous, they just have this still maintaining this popular conception that when something physical is strenuous, it means this. And it's like, it doesn't immediately equate. That's actually a certain culture of movement that you're thinking about right now, which again can be difficult to perceive because you feel like it's embodied. That's just the reaction. No, it's not. Just like the reaction of when I get in the cold shower. That's a cultural reaction. That's not an actual embodied reaction. If I wiped away all your cultural experience, it wouldn't necessarily be like that reaction. It might just be like, oh, cold water. But with the idea of intention, to inject this idea of mindfulness and movement, it has to be explicated. You have to describe it. And this is all we can do in the beginning. You can also see it as well, so you can also demonstrate it. And when you put the two next side to side, you can see someone who is moving with intention and someone who's not moving with intention. And the translation of that is what Shai Farhan most nicely described as quality. And what she said by quality was, did you mean what you meant to do? And for me, this was perfect, because using this idea of did you do what you meant to do means that you were thinking, you were reflecting, you had intention in that movement. And now that is a model in your mind. Did you meet that model you had in your mind? And of course, the people that I work with, the model is normally the video model that I present to them. So in many cases, for example, I use the example of a dragon squat, because a dragon squat is, very, very, as I say, eye-opening for people when they first use this particular movement, and then it becomes something that's just like, oh yeah, it's just dragon squat. Oh yeah, very fancy. However, the transition from side to side going through a dragon squat, I won't demonstrate it because I put it in a video that's online, but a dragon squat for me is a fantastic context to speak about the in-between of movements. So I'm just going to close this thing here a minute because it's shining in my eyes. But the in-between of movements is also something that is completely related to your intention. As I come up out of a dragon squat, where is the weight in my body? Like, am I shifted more on the left leg or more on the right leg? Or do I just come up and just switch legs and go back down and I have no second thought about it? So these are contexts that I can then specifically point out and say to someone, hey, look, in your practice, when you stand up out of the dragon squat, I want you to feel the weight on the perched leg, and then draw the line across behind you with the big toe through the water in as large as arc as you can. Shift the weight into that leg. Feel the weight steadily increase, 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 increase until the other foot becomes weightless. Draw that through behind you, the water again. Feel the weight placed back into the ball of that foot, sink into that position, be reverent, and then hold for the applicable time. So this would be a very concrete explanation of how to be mindful in movement. It's not enough just to say, oh, you need to have intention and be mindful. This is like the whimsical words of someone who thinks they're too important to actually explain the process of how to get there. If you don't have a process of how to get there, then it's not your place to be saying anything. You have nothing useful to share. You're just shouting from a treetop. I want to be able to throw the ladder down. I want to be able to say, hey, look, and I always say this as well in feedback as well. I'll write at the end, by the way, you are not going to get this from the beginning. Don't worry about it, because if you could get it, then why are we practicing? This is always the point as well. It must be something ongoing. It's something that can always be injected. So it then means on the point of the teacher to pick it up in all of those places where it's seen. And when you see recurring trends, I'll make a point of the face thing, and then I'll point out another place. So look here as well. Or if you notice someone's not breathing, you tell the person to breathe. It will bring more mindfulness towards their breathing, towards more just in the moment, because breathing happens in the moment. If you can see someone's holding their breath, this is something you can comment on as well, which will indirectly bring intention, attention, and mindfulness into their movement. So you have these different methods. You can explicate it, quite clearly. This, and this, and this is how you can do it. And then you can also speak about mechanisms and bring importance to mechanisms that will, as a result, bring more mindfulness into their movement. But make sure you're doing it first of all. This is the thing as well. So when I speak about stuff like, you be mindful in a push-up and things like this, some people are like, fucking, I was talking about push-ups now, he's going from complex to simple and back again. It's like, no, there's something in there. Like, you can revisit all of these contexts and find something valuable in it. And if you have not found anything valuable in them, then you haven't looked deeply enough. Because every movement has a particular value in a particular context, because there is no movement hierarchy. And if it is the practice, as it is for me, about exploring and investigating, and also kind of indulging in the potentials that gives you physiologically, it's of interest. It's all of interest. Just like, a fruit fly to the evolutionist is as valuable as a freaking king African elephant. There's no difference. Just because one's bigger and grander and has more movies made about it doesn't make it of more value than the tiny little fruit fly.
That's beautiful, man. I like that. So moving into last couple of questions, I want to ask you if you have any recommendations in terms of resources. I know you share a lot online, and I'll give you a chance to speak that at the end as well. But resources maybe online or in text that can really help people along their journey of, understanding some of the things that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, I'm personally, I'm not the best one to speak to about literary choices. I'm quite eclectic it's not eclectic necessarily in my reading. I'm quite personal in my reading in terms of I read what I feel I need. Like, so for example, I will try to think of, I do this very often, I'm sure other people do as well, but I just research gaps in either things like general knowledge or gaps in something to do with movement. Maybe it's a certain discipline, and I'll pick up a book or look into resources related to that. So the best thing I can say really that I would encourage is, research your knowledge and find where the gaps are that you think can be beneficial. So basic stuff like, for example, I didn't know anything about Winston Churchill really. So I just picked up an audiobook from Churchill and like some great stuff from it. But he was the prime minister of my country through a particularly completely world tumultuous period, and as an individual in his life did some pretty incredible things in his practice. The way that he practiced is insane. So there's value there, and it was something that I had no understanding of. Like Nelson Mandela, for example. I feel like I should know something about people who gave portions of their life and their entire lives to certain things that are of course valuable, and just to help in a way kind of fill in my own ignorance of certain times past. So I mean, with regards to those things, I can't necessarily give like a specific resource or thing like that. I can just encourage people to find those gaps and to try to fill them where you think they are applicable to you as a person, in your community, in your culture, in your nationality, perhaps as well. With regards to practice of movement, I would encourage the same thing. So for example, if you have an inclination or interest towards a subject that you're either involved in or would see yourself being involved in the future, or in some way your work seems to come in close connection with that, to investigate that through, for example, literature as well. So for example, I've read so much stuff about Taoism and like Tai Chi and all these different related practices and offshoots. And I have never ever had a Qigong lesson. I've been taken through some sequences and things. I've never been to a Tai Chi class. I've never moved, actually in these disciplines at all. But I cultivated the knowledge not for the sake of I want to know about Tai Chi, so when the Tai Chi practitioner talks to me, I can speak about movement. And no, it's more the case of like, value is there. There's obviously something of value. I want to see what's valuable and what can I take. And if it is connected with movement, which of course it is, that I can find the crossovers and the commonalities, which are going to be of the most interest to my practice. So this is one reason that you can, I would encourage people to, research into literature and other disciplines. And then of course, then if you're starting to involve yourself in a discipline, I mentioned this before, but for example, previously when I started practicing capoeira, I felt, my duty to also, look into the literature, because there's a huge cultural history there, a national history, and the game itself is not just about, playing the game of capoeira. There is ritual, there is investment from people's, life, spirit, and souls in that game. I feel like it would be wrong of me not to at least have an understanding of what they are investing, even though, of course, I'm not investing it myself as they are. So this is something else I would encourage. So to look for resources and around things that if you're looking to enter, if you're practicing a particular discipline as well. And again, as I said, I'm sure most people would do this in that particular case, but those are the things that I've found particularly valuable. And of course, then always bringing it back to my own practice. What are the commonalities that might be in there? What are some differences that perhaps I can learn from this? What are perhaps some conflicts that don't quite sit right? Why are they conflicts? Can we resolve some of these things to the effect that I might learn something more about it, have a more evolved opinion on that idea? Thinking about more like specific texts, like like reading it now, and then I'm referring to a book, and I mentioned it to a friend recently as well, who read it, who is, as you might say, a more advanced practitioner. But I mean, he's just been exploring the perspective of movement for a longer time than I had been when I first read this book. But a nice book is Exuberant Animal by Frank Forencich. I pronounce his name correctly. And the reason I like to present Exuberant Animal to people, and I always put these kind of links to these books in programming, is that it's very light, and it speaks about joyful movement. And for me, this is very, very refreshing and very even eye-opening when you come from a perspective of movement purely within the realm of, for example, sports or disciplines or fitness, for example. If you just come from movement as associated with exercise, it really does, through the little stories that it tells, which in itself have that very playful nature. It's very, very liberating, I think, for the person approaching something like the idea of like movement practice, to just understand, okay, there's more to moving than just exercising for an abstract idea. It's the feeling of moving, the exuberance, the joy. And how can you be joyful in your movement when you're moving and all you're thinking about is how fat you are or how unfit you are and how you need to correct this? This is a very, very sad reason to move, when this could just come as a side effect if you just absorb yourself in the practice. So yeah, this is a very, very valuable book for me, and particularly with this word joy in movement. I mean, it's often said, you practice, you have to be happy with your practice. Practice needs to make you happy, or blah blah blah. I think very often the terms happiness and joy get misconstrued and interchangeable, where happiness is fleeting. Happiness is the moment. I'm happy, now I'm sad. This happens. Joy, you don't need happiness to be joyful, and joyfulness does not always equate to happiness. Joyfulness for me is closely related with passion. Passion is the investment that you then give to it. You do it with a passion. The joy is something much, 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 much deeper, something that you have to practice. Joy does just not just come. If you want to be a joyful person, if you want to have joyful movement and exuberance in your movement, as the title of the book proposes, it has to be worked upon. You cannot, immediately disassociate yourself from, workout is strenuous, hard stuff. I do workout. And then think about joyfulness and exuberance in your movement. It's not compatible. You have to work on it. It has to be reinterpreted. You have to reinterpret your experience, reflect on your experience, and then experience it through the practice as well. So this is the book that I always recommend. The last thing that I would recommend is more kind of subject-wise, is into anything that relates to perspectives of, this is more of a philosophical perspective, but the idea of the superfluous nature of time as we have it now, the incontingence of everything we do, the chance of it all. Something that Stoicism is a good way to look at, but it has kind of its limitations, and sometimes Stoicism can kind of turn a bit like into apathy. I've seen friends have this, they're like Stoic to the point of like, don't really care. That's not where we're going, not that Stoic. More in the essence of Stoicism towards action, towards responsibility. Speaking about the idea of the void, the nothing. The idea is that the postmodernists, in my interpretation of the things I encountered from the work that I did into research, really opened this empty gap that was like, there's nothing beyond the meaning. It's meaningless. It's we're just references of references, where we're talking about, this is what what I tried to dig out with the idea of the image of the built body. When I was involved in writing about bodybuilding, through the perspective of postmodernism, it was like, no, this image now is just a complete shell. It means nothing. You're just building a body and there's nothing of value behind it. And it's like, man, when there are people gathered by, you know, the throngs around a certain thing, there's normally something about that thing that is of value. Whether that value is good or bad is to be seen, but it's worth paying some attention to, and not just throwing it away as like a child's image trying to create something that's already dead, you know. Because what happens in the void of this postmodern idea of, you know, this emptiness is opportunity to create. Opportunity to create and responsibility to create. You are responsible for yourself. And it's not up to everyone that they have to take that responsibility to then create something for themselves. And this is something that you can see with people's life choices in terms of their work or things like this. Some people are very, very happy, and in terms of they work a job that the meaning is given. They don't have to create the meaning for themselves. They have a position, that's your position. You go into the position, you work that function, meaning is created. But it wasn't self-created meaning. It was meaning that was already pre-established, and you were plugged into that meaning. But the idea that I would encourage people to read into is this perspective of, like, you know, a Stoic perspective of, you know, okay, there's a de-ambition with regards to my practice. I'm not so hell-bent on this, you know, getting this one thing or this one idea that it drives my entire practice. So when that one idea falls away, that I have, you know, not even a shitty leg to stand on. It's the idea of being able to adapt, being able to change, accept and adapt, whatever those changes might be throughout your practice. Because, for example, if I was still doing bodybuilding or if something like that, and I didn't have my weights at home, where would I be during quarantine? Wasting away. My muscles would be trickling and, you know, falling away. But it's the same thing. I do not say this to denigrate anyone's practice in any way. I'm speaking just from a practical point of view. But what can help this is also a perspective, this kind of Stoic aspect of, like, no, I can't practice my hypertrophy today, but there's many other things that I can do. And in fact, this is an opportunity. I can now take this opportunity to practice those things I've been neglecting that will, in the long run, feed back into my main practice. If you don't have the tools or the understanding to see how there's things you could do to feed back into your main practice, you've got the responsibility to find out what those things are, because there are many things that you can do, and perhaps not even physiologically, perhaps other things. You can do research, you can do whatever you want to do. But it is forefronted by the idea of you're responsible for yourself. And at the end of the day, I went to bed. No, at the end of the day, it's all you have. Like, I very often have this perspective of myself, very often is like kind of the lone wolf perspective, but it's like, there was an old saying that my first bodybuilding coach used to say to me: no one is, I don't know why he chose these words, but no one can sneeze for you and no one can have self-discipline for you. You have to do what you know is right in that time. If you don't know what's right in that time, do your research. Pick up a book that will tell you what you need to do in that time towards what you want to do. If you're relying on other people, it will last for a little bit until that person's gone or that thing is gone. And then what have you got left on? If you have no support structures, I'm sorry, there's no one to blame but yourself. And that goes for everything. You know, emotionally, do you emotionally depend on someone? Do you financially depend on someone? Does your physical practice depend on someone else? There's nothing wrong with receiving input and help and things from other people, but dependence is something that should be monitored, because normally those dependencies are areas which are room for self-improvement, room for exploration, opportunities for you to dig into yourself. And this is something that in general, there are many books and many philosophies, whether it's from, you know, Taoist perspectives, where it's from like an ancient, pick up meditations by Marcus Aurelius, read the Tao Te Ching, read these types of classics that talk about the ideas of de-ambition, change, acceptance, because this is the stuff that will not only filter into your practice, and not only will your practice complement this in return. You know, if we talk about life practice, which for me is just movement practice, in all honesty, I don't have a term life practice. I don't like this term life practice for myself. I have a movement practice because this is what I'm practicing. It's invaluable and it's in everything. It's inescapable. When it exists in these thousands of year old, doctrines or philosophies or lessons that have been passed through the ages, and there are commonalities between them that are screaming out. If you can wipe away the top stuff, if you can wipe away, the culture and the practice and things of what they're doing, normally underneath it, this is what I found, it ultimately relates to the movement of things. We talk about change, we talk about Tao. Tao is change, Tao is the way. What is change? It's change from one condition to another. That's how you have change. So actually change is the condition. Change is the result. Change is the action that's happening. But what is the underlying condition between change? It's movement. It moves from one state of being to another. So underneath everything, even this idea of stillness, I still have my reservations about stillness, because there's two symbols. We have like yin and we have yang, but then we have the empty circle. Yeah, this is actually on a rung. I say a rung above. I can't remember what it might be in Tao referred to as like the original energy that's passed down from your mother and father. You just have the empty circle. For me, I see this as a movement. So many people will completely be like, "What are you talking about? It's not movement, because movement's one part of the yin and yang." But I don't mean movement as in like the moving of it. I mean movement as a concept. Movement as inclusive of stillness. Because if you can't have stillness without movement, well, then we can just call it movement, unless you just want to call it stillness. But if stillness is always incorporated within movement, surely we can just speak of this thing, movement. And then of course that comes very closely to the idea of, in that case, then it just is. That is being, that is movement. So for me, I would encourage anyone who hasn't already looked deeply into these, classical perspectives that tie within acceptance of change, the ability, mechanisms to be able to cope with that, whether that's a Stoic perspective or something like that. That's something that I would encourage as well. I mentioned it, Marcus Aurelius's book. I always share the one which is Zen in the Art of Archery. One of my friends, a German friend, said he can't read it in German. He hates it in German, but I thought in English it was absolutely fine. And yeah, so other than that, I'm not too much of a shelf picker and like throwing books at people. When I recommend read books in like programming and things like that, which I do, it's followed up with just some subcategories of ideas of what they're about, like the ambition, ancestral, blah 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 blah. So to encourage the person that I'm not saying this book is the book you need to read and it will change your mind and everything. I'm saying that these subject areas are of interest, and this book is an example of something you can read in that particular area.
Fabulous, mate. So last question. If you could go back and give yourself some advice to your 8-year ago self, what might that be?
I have to think back 8 years ago, 2012. Whoo. I was probably in Australia at 2012, actually. I think I just arrived. So yeah, I think my advice probably would have been reflect more on what you're doing. I was very much about action, very, very much doing, do. And without thought of actually what the consequences of those actions could be. I think this is in many cases we do this when we're younger as well. Not that I'm old at all. I still do it now, of course. There's stuff that I do that I can't fully foresee the consequences, but that is, that's, no one can have foresight, and to mull over foresight and go, oh, I should have known, is a complete waste of your existence. Like wondering about stuff that could have been. Just let it affect what you do now. So that's what I would say, to be more reflective on your physical practice of what you're doing. I would also then say, bring more attention to certain practices that you are maybe neglecting. Because I was doing stuff back then that I don't do so much now, which I'm thankful for. Back then I was doing a lot of creative writing. I was reading a lot of, philosophy and reading a lot of creative works. But there were like other things I could have also been reading, such as reading into different types of disciplines for a start, or even reading into like more of the humanities, like learning stuff about the world, basically. Like I was traveling around and I had firsthand experience of types of things. But then like, if you ask me, even now, you ask me the geography of certain places, or you're asking me about the cultures or the history of certain places, I have very limited knowledge. So it would be just, try to expand your literary knowledge base a bit more laterally. This is something that you can invest in. And yeah, other than that, I mean, quite thankfully at this time, I was questioning certain things, but just not about my physical practice. It would be, continue with the, questioning what is of value. Because at this time as well, I was still working in the early parts of 2011. I just got out of working in office work, and I ended up entering back into office work, which is something I said at that point I would never do. And I almost got myself tied into a contract for working in an office as manager of a particular department. And I was seriously considering it, speaking with friends about it, because I was going to get sponsored and to stay in Australia and live and work in this office job. And thank fucking God, I made the decision that I didn't do it. And what I did, I quit everything. I left myself without a job, and I decided to start up just as a personal trainer off my own back from nothing. I was lucky that the first gym I walked in, they gave me a really good deal to start up there. And then I just, with the practice I was doing at the time, I just kind of blew up and managed to support myself. But that was something that was not necessarily in my nature. As I mentioned, I kind of have this reserve type nature that in some cases I would be happy just to shut the doors and just train by myself. But I would encourage myself to know, not only expand beyond yourself, so to speak, basically be more social. Be more social. I can be in some aspects antisocial in a way in certain areas that I need to improve. But this case, it's essentially stepping out of your comfort zone. But if you think there's something that you're able to do, make your daily actions lead towards that outcome. Very often I feel that in myself as well, once you do have an idea of where you want to go or what you want to be, or an idea of what you want to do or contribute or create, do your daily actions or the actions you're doing right now contribute some way to that end goal? If not, what is the function of those actions? Sometimes they do have a function. Sometimes, you need some catharsis, or sometimes, or whatever it is. But are they being detrimental? That's a first question to ask. Are my actions actually detrimental to what I want in the long run? If so, you're a shitty practitioner. Like, what are you doing? But then, of course, constantly coming back and going, okay, no, what I want tomorrow is being founded on the actions of what I do today. Because ultimately, what you ever have is only ever based on what you do now, because there is no other time. Yeah, you can speak about what you did in the past, but it never really happened in the past. That's just a way we can just containerize it. We can go into this thing, but not. What are you doing right now, right this second? What are you putting your effort into? And if it's not towards something that you consider something of value to you and somewhere you want to go, reconsider what those things are. So I'm very thankful, and I would verify that to myself. I'd be like, hey, look, no, stay to the path that you think of it's right. Even if you think it's shit, just fucking drop that stuff. You told yourself you would never do it again. Drop it, leave it, and make all your actions count towards what you ultimately want to do, what you ultimately want to be, what you ultimately want to create.
Powerful stuff, man. So where can people find more of your work, resources, and the services that you offer?
Yeah, so it depends on your taste. The people like Instagram, you can look on Instagram. There's MoveMore MP. Everything's MoveMore MP. MP means movement practice, basically. So MoveMore MP on Instagram. This is normally, I'm less active on Instagram now, quite purposefully, because it just takes up too much time. For a time when I thought it was important, helped me to connect with more people. I was investing a lot in it. Now I like post something once a week maybe, but I still try to make it something that's of value. But normally I'm filtering a lot more energy in, still I'm taking more care of the YouTube channel now, because I saw a lot of response from that. So if you're interested in actually having usable resources, some actual tools and stuff that you might be able to use, more like videos that are basically longer than a minute, then I would encourage you to look through there, look through the open resources playlist. There's some stuff in there. There's also a series, the proofing series is being unfolded on there as well. The website is where you can just generally read about me and some perspectives. Please keep in mind that when you look at a website, I think of anyone that it's an advertising tool. That's what a website is. So it doesn't necessarily completely reflect who this person is and what that person is about. So I do put stuff on there, of course, to something I think will be useful to a general audience that are just reading it. So when certain stuff is written on there, if you think, oh, guys, completely cheesy, but whatever, it's like, yeah, come and speak to me in person. So in any case, that's where you can find more stuff about me, about the services that I also offer. The main services that I provide at the moment are one-to-one online coaching through online support. There's currently a waiting list for that. So if you're interested, do get in soon so I can put you on that waiting list. Maybe take some more people next year. And if you're interested in actually having some programming from me, which is standardized, but it is created in such a way that it's meant to be accessible for people from all walks of life, with all levels and with all abilities. That is available on the Elements page, also accessible from the website, the Elements for aspects of your physical practice. This is a continually evolving project. The next one I might release at some point is related to foundations in floor communication, which again is my interpretation and my perspective on what this actually might mean. It will be seen through the programming. And then, of course, if people are in the area of burn, you're always welcome to join for a class. At the moment, classes are, of course, on and off due to the restrictions, and same with workshops. Lastly, one thing that is coming up that I'm working on, because it was requested many, many times, I just never really thought of the means to present it, is access for people in more of a teaching role to essentially the entire video resource library which I have, which is thousands of movements in isolated and and interconnected types of capacities. So what it's going to present is, I'm still working it into subjects. I need to remake a lot of things and continue making some stuff, which means that will be available through a service to people who are not so perhaps interested in having things programmed, but they want to have access to certain resources in subject form that they can either practice as of their own will and incorporate into their own practice, or share with people that they are teaching, for example, and see the resources that I present. It will take a lot of time though, because I will have to go through, some of the things I've written individually on essentially the why, what, and how of this particular movement, but most of it needs to be written. So it'll probably take another year before that's like kind of usable there. But that is something that I would like to provide in the future, because it also helps me verify, okay, why have I been providing this movement for people for so many years? Why is it so valuable? How has it led to certain things that I'm able to do physiologically now, in certain capacities that I have? Why are these fundamental tools that I consider are worth sharing with people to then share with other people? And that's what I would like to put in ultimately what will just be access to the MoveMore video library. So yeah, something for the future.
Fabulous, man. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the MBODY podcast. I've enjoyed it heaps. It's been a nice long conversation, but I think it's been awesome in terms of what we dug into there. And I'm glad that you ran with your ideas, and I thought you really painted a nice picture. So thanks so much for your time, Jason. I really appreciate you coming on.
Hey, thank you very much, Pat. And lastly, as I always say, of course, is thanking you as well. I just have to make sure that anyone who's listening, or anyone who's worked with me, anyone who's visited anything, anyone who's bought a program, you are supporting me, and I take that to heart. I cannot do what I do unless people are there to respond, to connect in whatever way it is. This is why, for example, if you take a service from me, I respond to everyone individually, because I'm in a capacity to do that, of course, but also because I really do value the ability to do what it is that I do, and to be able to just practice the way that I want to practice, because people find value in what it is that I'm sharing. And as I said previously, in the beginning, you can only go out on a whim and say, I'm pretty sure this is of value to people. I think this is something that I feel confident in sharing. And to have a response that people are actually connecting with it and supporting, this is something that I cannot be thankful for enough. So, and if you do support in some particular way, whether that's just listening to a podcast or whether that's you join for a workshop, or if you work with me one-to-one, my thanks is endless.
So yeah, thanks again, man. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Cheers.